tank.
Engines at 65%. Three
We listen
engines,
to Mission
running
Control
normally,
at
three
Houston
fuel cells,
as they communicated with us some 3 hours,
velocity
4 hours ago.
257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. Three engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Go with throttle up. Increase your power to make orbit, and it will be hard to forget the voice of the Mission Control communicator, talking on as he reads off his telemetry, not aware, as those who were watching it were aware, that this tragedy had
different aircraft. This was Scobie's Challenger's pilot on this 25th shuttle launch was Michael Smith, age 40, a decorated Navy pilot from North Carolina, who became a shuttle astronaut in 1980. This was his first mission. He is survived by his wife and 3 children. Mission specialist Judy Resnick became an astronaut in 1978. Her specialty, electrical engineering. This was her second shuttle mission. She had logged 144 hours, 57 minutes in space. Ronald McNair, age 36, also a mission specialist, was selected as an astronaut in 1979. He, too, was a veteran of the shuttle, making his first shuttle flight in 1984, bringing his background in physics and laser technology to the program. The third mission specialist on today's launch was Air Force Colonel Ellison Onizuka, age 39, born in Hawaii. A former aerospace engineer and pilot, he had taught at the elite Air Force Test Pilot School in California. He became a NASA astronaut in 1979. Onizuka was on his second shuttle mission. His initial flight in 1984 was the first dedicated to the Department of Defense. He was married with 2 children. Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist, age 41, was a Hughes aircraft engineer on board to conduct tests on the effects of weightlessness on fluids carried in tanks. Born in Detroit, trained as an Air Force satellite engineer, this was Jarvis's first shuttle mission. He is survived by his wife. And finally, Krista McAuliffe, age 37, the social studies teacher from New Hampshire, the first private citizen selected to fly aboard the shuttle. She'd been chosen from more than 11,000 applicants nationwide. She's survived by her husband, 2 children, and the students in Concord, New Hampshire.
ABC Stone Phillips. I'm sorry it took us a while to get to that, to bring you the human dimension of the other.
Waits for you know what the delays that have gone on. This is a time when no one can say no when you're on your way. It's a feeling of exaltation as well as satisfaction, but now you've got it all in your hands. That crew is flying in mission at this point in time, and they're on their way. They can feel the thrust and the rumble of those engines is phenomenal. It's hard to explain unless you've been there, but you can just imagine from what you've seen. And now at this point, having been there several times, I can tell you that you begin never to feel complacent, but you do begin to feel that things are working in your favor. The most critical time of this mission, at least in most of our eyes, was those first 10 or 15 seconds to get off the pad. And so the surprise of what is to occur at this point in time was, I'm sure, even beyond comprehension of the crew, although there was several minutes yet to go on the flight. Anything can happen as we see it well. The crew now is getting down to almost a pseudo-routine. It's dynamic, things are happening, but they have practiced this over and over again. And should there be an emergency, and should they detect an emergency, they would have been able to separate from those boosters and get off and land a vehicle home. But as we see in a moment, I use the word consumed several times. I have no other word. The spacecraft was literally consumed in microseconds. Neither the crew, as we've heard, neither the ground, nobody, even in, not only didn't anticipate it, almost didn't realize it happened.
We've said it many times before, Gene, and again for people just joining us perhaps first time, the Mission Control communicator just went on talking as if he had missed it and had not seen it at all. Gene Cernan joining us again this morning to help us understand the dimensions of...
Judy Resnick behind him, Ron McNair, Mike Smith, all of them headed out to the launch pad, confident that today would be the day. We're going to go, they said earlier on today, headed for the van that would take them out to the launch pad. It was a very, very clear, very, very cold morning at the Cape today. We were talking about ice problems earlier on. There was the chance, if they lifted off with icicles around the shuttle, that one of those icicles might break off and damage the heat protection tiles. That would pose a hazard to re-entry, and so they were worried about that. They delayed because of that problem for some time. But there is, again, no connection between anything that could have resulted from that and the tragedy today. This is Christa McAuliffe putting on a vest that is full of life-preserving equipment should the shuttle land on the water. There is always that contingency that they plan for, as they plan for any number of them. That vest has a life preserver in it that could keep an astronaut afloat for some 24 hours, food and things like that. That's one of the contingencies that they plan for. There are ways that they can get out of that hatch and swing down into the water if, in fact, they were to land on the water. That contingency is one of several, as I say, that NASA plans for including the landing at one of several overseas landing sites. We were all very aware of the possibility of that some missions ago when a sensor indicated that a main engine had shut down on the shuttle. It turned out that it was the sensor's fault, not the engine's fault. Everybody was very scared about that, and we became very aware at that point of the possibility of something serious happening to the shuttle. People who are close to the program, astronauts all the time, say something's going to happen serious one day. But as you have pointed out, Tom, so many times this morning, and as so many observers have pointed out, it's become part of our lives. How could something happen to something that's as fun and as glamorous as the space shuttle? Well, today, obviously, it did. A tragedy of enormous proportions. Tom?
Thank you very much, Dan Molina. As we indicated recently, there's been a lot of attention about journalists going into space. Walter Cronkite appearing in space regalia on the front page of some newspapers and in liftoff of the Space Shuttle Challenger with 7 people on board.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Those are the parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, the parents of Christa McAuliffe. It appears at this point they don't know what has happened, but others, of course, realize that something seriously has gone wrong. In slow motion now. To my eye, at least, it appears that the entire external tank just came apart and became one gigantic fireball. It would have been, at that point, a bomb. To the right, you see the solid rocket booster peeling off. It appears that it was that big fuel tank that we see attached to it, the largest part of the shuttle program, that just seemed to come apart. And, of course, it is chock-a-block with volatile oxygen and hydrogen to fuel the main engines. The parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, as they were watching that, didn't quite know what to believe as we looked at them. And, of course, this was their first launch, and as they looked at it, it appeared that there may have been a second booster going off one kind or another. But, unfortunately, that was not the case at all. In Concord, New Hampshire, where Christa McAuliffe was a school teacher, the entire community was involved, as you might expect. Her 3rd grade class was at Cape Canaveral today with a large banner watching that tragic scene. The banner said, "Go, Christa, go." And at a high school auditorium, there were about 1,500 students assembled so that they could watch on television Here are the kids.
4, 3, 2, 1.
The successful liftoff, lots of celebration. But then something is wrong.
Would everybody please go back to class at this time?
They were immediately sent back to their classes, stunned, as we all were, by what had happened. But a much closer personal attachment to at least one member of that shuttle crew, Krista McAuliffe, a school teacher in the community of Concord. The ebullience of high school students drained from them as they watched on television screens as the shuttle blew up today. Sharon, Krista McAuliffe, and 6 other astronauts apparently have died in that gigantic fireball explosion. The crews continue to search the ocean with a variety of vessels and airborne vehicles, helicopters, and Coast Guard cutters are out there. They were kept from the area for some time because of the debris. Jay Barberie is a veteran reporter on these space programs. He's been down in Cocoa Beach, Florida since the very beginning of the space program. He was there today and he watched all of this as well. Jay?
Well, it was something that you didn't want to see, Tom. We were watching it as it took place into a blue sky, and we were watching it as it happened. Of course, when we saw it, we knew what had happened, but we just didn't want to believe it. And now the recovery forces are hard at work 18 miles east of here, trying to find what is remaining, the remains, rather, of Challenger and the crew.
Jay, no word whatsoever, I gather, from the NASA officials who are still assembled there. They're giving you no indication, and we expect, what, a press briefing in about 20 minutes or so?
That's correct. We will have the top officials here, and at that time, we should know what has been taking place since the Challenger went down. But as now, there's only speculation and only looking at the videotapes, and we know the recovery crews are out there. What they've found, we do not know, but we should know shortly.
What happened to Krista's husband and children and her parents? Do you know? Where were they taken?
Well, they were, of course, escorted by NASA personnel, and I'm sure that they were taken back to the astronaut quarters, which is only a couple of miles from here, and I'm sure they're in seclusion there.
And as you looked at that videotape, as we looked at it together, what was your judgment, Jay? You've watched a lot of these go up, of course, and you've not seen anything quite like this before. But did it appear to you, as it did to me, that it could have been the external tank that went first?
I don't think there's any question about it, Tom. I think you're absolutely correct. It was the external tank. Now, the question is, when they told him he was go for throttle up, he increased the throttle pressure, increased the thrust on the 3' engines. The question is, was there a flare back of the engines at that time? If there was a flare back, this could have erupted the external fuel tank. There could have been any kind of eruption of the ducts leading the hydrogen and the oxygen into the engines. But it occurred at the base of that tank without question. Why it occurred, of course, is the question.
Is it conceivable, and again we point out that this is only speculation on our part, but is it conceivable that it might have been weather related, that there was ice forming, of course, at the base of the main engine earlier in the day? Is it possible that ice may have played a role in all of this?
It's very possible. A chunk of ice off of the external fuel tank itself could have ruptured the ducts leading the fuel from the tank itself into the main engines. Another possibility are the wind currents at maximum Q. At that time, in the position that the spacecraft was in, the wind, the current there, could have had something to do with the flare back of the engines. No one really knows. There's a lot of things that you can speculate about, but what we do know, Tom, without any question, that explosion occurred in the external fuel tank where 500,000 gallons of fuel was located. That thing is 15 stories tall. So if you can imagine a 15-story tall building, something holding 500,000 gallons of fuel, then you can imagine what sort of explosion that happened.
All right, we want to show once again on the model that we have here in our Washington studios just what we're talking about. This is the space shuttle itself. This is the vehicle. This is the Challenger, and it is attached to all of this propellant. These are the solid rocket boosters on either side. They develop 1 million pounds of thrust apiece, and as Jay indicated to you, in this large external tank, which originally was painted white, and then they removed the paint because they determined they didn't need it and they wanted to save the weight, this 15 stories high altogether, filled with oxygen and hydrogen, and it fuels the main engines, which are located at the very base down here of the shuttle Challenger, and the other shuttles for that matter as well. They're used on liftoff, and then they're used as well to get them into orbit. Then they're fired up once again when they come back into the Earth's atmosphere. You remember that phrase, MECO, that's main engine cutoff. They fire them up to about 65% on liftoff, then they go to 104% or even higher if they need to go into the orbit itself. And it was just at that point when they went past 65%, past 100%, full throttle, shortly after that, that this appeared to just break into flames. And then, of course, we saw that large fireball. So the indications are, at the outset at least, that it happened somewhere in here, possibly in these ducts. And as Jay Barbary indicated, there are ducts that lead from the external tank here back into the main engines. That's where it may have occurred. There's always the possibility that a number of other things could have happened as well that then triggered all of this fuel that is contained there. At any rate, it's like a giant rocket going off, a Roman candle, if you will, with 2 on each side and a much larger one in the middle. And people positioned right up here, 7 of them all together today, with no means of getting out of there once they have launched. That is, that there is no escape hatch of any kind, no ejection seat. And based on what we saw today, there was very little to eject from, tragically enough. To remind you, in about 20 minutes, we expect to have a press briefing from the officials at NASA at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida. We may know more then. Of course, they have a wide variety of data, telemetry of all kinds, signals coming in electronically and otherwise. They'll be looking at that and analyzing it, if in fact they can. The entire country shocked by what we have witnessed here today. I'm sure that
the explosion.
Well, there's no question that the area in the immediate vicinity of the fuel tank and the solid rockets has an anomalous flame, which is undoubtedly the cause of this tragedy. But what led to that condition will have to await a very thorough detective investigation using the number of parts that can be recovered and analyzed to see what initiated this failure.
Leo Krupp, that veteran pilot and consultant who's been with us through part of this afternoon, Dr. Payne mentioned that he believed on the slow motion videotape, and he emphasized that he was simply speculating on the basis of his experience, that there seemed to be, what did you call it, Leo Krupp, a flame vapor at the base of the solid rocket booster in that area that raised a question in your mind, a suspicious area in which to look. I wonder, Dr. Payne, if you saw that as well.
Well, my experience has been that the first indications that you get on accidents like this frequently later have to be modified. So I don't think I would speculate except to say that very clearly there was a catastrophic failure of the external fuel tank. And what initiated it, we'll have to, I think, we'll have to wait and see what the analysis shows.
Dr. Payne, what about this very ambitious launch schedule this year, and what, if any, effect would that have on safety in general? Now, let's set aside the question, the direct question, whether it affected today's launch. We have no way of knowing. But there was a very ambitious launch schedule, and there was considerable pressure, was there not?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think the real significance here is that we have in the space shuttle the entire national launch capability for many of the payloads that are proposed for the shuttle. So therefore, the loss of the shuttle, while we have to go back and rework and find out how to fix this problem before we fly again, is going to cause some very severe dislocations in the nation's space program. The nature of this dislocation remains to be seen, but there's no question it's going to be a very serious problem.
Dr. Payne, if you can still hear me, the effect on congressional support for the space program. Effect has been waning. Would that be too strong a word in the United States Congress? There's no indication that any of the 7 Americans aboard the space shuttle survived. the National Aeronautics and Space Administration has scheduled a news conference, the first really word that it's had to say since the tragedy, for 3:30 Eastern Time this afternoon, coming up in about 12 or 13 minutes. This is part of our CBS News live coverage, which we've been on since shortly after the tragedy occurred this morning. We will be bringing you live from Cape Canaveral, Florida, that National Aeronautics and Space Administration news conference from Florida. We also want to point out that contrary to an earlier announcement, President Reagan now has decided that he will not go through with his previously scheduled State of the Union address this evening. The State of the Union address has been postponed for 1 week until next Tuesday by President Reagan. However, the President has had Larry Speaks, his principal spokesman at the White House, say that he, President Reagan, plans to talk to the American people sometime during this day or possibly this evening about what the White House calls this tragedy. We have no details yet on when President Reagan will be speaking or what form that will take, but CBS News does intend to carry that live if at all possible. And of course, we will have full details on everything that we can report on this evening's CBS Evening News. Now, the rescue ships and helicopters that raced to the point 18 miles off the Florida coast where the debris from the shuttle came down. The debris rained into the ocean for about 45 minutes, and the rescue ships and some of the planes and helicopters were delayed getting into the area because the debris was raining down. So reports from that area say that still all the rescue ships have seen, and that includes the paramedics who were parachuted actually into the sea to help with the search, that the most they have found are rather small pieces of debris. The spaceship was being propelled by 2 solid fuel booster rockets and its 3 main hydrogen-burning engines. Those are the small engines at the tail of the spacecraft itself. The pilot and the co-pilot were throttling up just before, in the seconds before the explosion occurred. It was not immediately determined if the source of the explosion was one of the boosters or in the main engine system. It may be a long while before anyone knows. There had been a 2-hour delay in the launch of the space shuttle this morning because of the extreme cold for Florida, about 28 degrees. There were icicles over much of the space shuttle and the apparatus that gets it into launch. NASA delayed the launch for 2 hours this morning, made a number of close inspections, and then as the weather began to heat up, NASA felt it could go ahead with the launch. It did. Everything looked all right for about 65 to 68 seconds. Then there was an indication only as we saw the slow motion videotape later, an early indication that something might be wrong, and then suddenly 72 to 75 seconds in, a major explosion and a ball of flame. Mission Control in Houston said very early after the tragedy that it had no indication of any trouble aboard the spacecraft. The last words heard from the spacecraft were, Roger, throttle up. That meant that they were going to take the throttle from about 60 to 65% of power on up for power as they tried to get the space shuttle thrown forward closer to orbit. Keep in mind, as we pointed out several times, that the space shuttle's own engines are not enough to get it off the launch pad and throw it toward orbit. That's the reason they have those solid rocket boosters. The solid rocket boosters, after they do their job of getting the whole payload off the ground and headed toward outer space, they drop away. The space shuttle's engines then continue on, drawing on the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen in the main tank to put the spacecraft on into orbit. 2 senators and a congressman, we're now told, have flown in space.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And the spacecraft, in increasingly small pieces of debris, rained down into the ocean off the coast of Florida. Now, we want to use our small model. We're going to give a slow motion videotape look at what happened. But before we do so, a review. This is a scale model. This is the space shuttle itself. Keep in mind the crew has only a small area in which it's actually housed for most of the time. Most of the space shuttle is in the cargo area. Down below that, the cargo area that opens up, that's where the satellites are launched from once the shuttle gets into orbit. The space shuttle itself sets aboard a huge fuel tank, about 500,000 pounds of liquid oxygen and hydrogen. This fuel is what fuels the space shuttle's own engines, the 3 engines right in the tail of the space shuttle. But those 3 engines are not enough to get the space shuttle up into orbit. So on launch, the space shuttle's own engines have to be going, drawing on the liquid oxygen and hydrogen fuel, and the 2 solid rocket boosters off to the side of the main fuel tank are part of the original launch configuration. These are the solid rocket boosters. At launch, the solid rocket boosters go, the space shuttle's own 3 engines go, and to get it off the pad. Then the commander of the space shuttle throttles back to about 60% in order to get maximum effect. The aerodynamics of the situation require him, with gravity figured in, to throttle back to about 60-65% of power. Then at a certain stage after this whole apparatus, the solid rocket boosters, the main tank, and the shuttle itself get up and make a slight turn. Plan is, and always has been, for the space shuttle commander to throttle up. Those are the last words from the space shuttle, Roger, throttling up. And it was shortly after that that the whole thing exploded. Now watch on the slow motion videotape, because down in here, in what we will call the left, in the lower side of the left solid rocket booster, you will first see some little indications of possible flames could have been caused by vapors, and then the whole explosion occurred. Let's go now to the slow motion videotape as we wait and prepare for NASA's news conference. You see the little flame in the middle left-hand side. Then the beginnings of an explosion. Just exactly where it's happening, hard to tell. Could be in the solid rocket boosters, could be in the main tank. Then, once the explosion, the flames explosion reach the main tank, which has that highly explosive, highly volatile liquid hydrogen, the space shuttle is obliterated. No ejection seats aboard the space shuttle. The early space shuttles had ejection seats, but after the first 3 or 4 flights, ejection seats, because of the increasing numbers of people put aboard the space shuttle and the belief that ejection seats wouldn't do any good, there were no ejection seats on this space shuttle. Note in the upper right-hand quarter of the screen, I know that that's gone off of your screen for the moment, there was a piece of what is believed to be the right-hand solid rocket booster. You see in the upper right-hand quarter, that's it, a piece, if not indeed the entire, what is believed to be the right-hand side solid rocket booster. Remember that the early indication of trouble was on the lower left-hand solid rocket booster side. No ejection seats aboard the space shuttle today. As Leo Krupp, our consultant with CBS News from years past, has pointed out, there is a moment, a second, one's tempted to say a nanosecond, but just a few seconds in which the pilot of the space shuttle, the commander and the pilot or co-pilot who's monitoring, when he sees a red light, there's a few seconds there where, if he knows there is trouble, that he can have the spacecraft itself separate from all of this fuel and the solid rocket boosters. That did not happen today as far as anyone can determine. NASA at Mission Control in Houston simply did not know in the minutes right after the explosion what had happened or why it had happened. But there was no indication that during those moments when the pilot could have separated the space shuttle from all of this fuel, there's no indication that he even attempted to do so. We simply don't know whether he had even the slightest indication of trouble aboard the spacecraft. One wants to keep in mind, need we remind ourselves, that we're still in the infancy of space exploration and travel, that we're in the very, historically, the very earliest seconds of space exploration. And while we've learned a lot about spaceships, fuel, mixing liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, computers, telemetry, aerodynamics, and all of that, that we only know such a tiny amount, really, about how it all works, where we can proceed from here. And it's in that atmosphere, from one doesn't want to say historical standpoint, but from that atmosphere that those 7 Americans were aboard the space shuttle today. One of the things that these flights is designed to do is to increase man's knowledge about space flight, which is quite a different thing, a much more dangerous thing, certainly now, than flight in the Earth's own atmosphere. Now, NASA has put back its news conference, which was scheduled to begin about a minute ago. Had originally been scheduled for 3:30 this afternoon Eastern Time. NASA has now put back that news conference until 4 o'clock. We're also told that Vice President Bush and Senator John Glenn, whom you heard a few moments ago, the former astronaut, Senator John Glenn, Vice President Bush and Senator John Glenn have just taken off from Andrews Air Force Base for Cape Canaveral. President Reagan had relayed word earlier through his spokesman, Larry Speaks, at or about the time it was set.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute, 15 seconds.
As you can see, in today's launch on the left, there was an explosion, perhaps a small one or several small ones at first, then a larger one. It occurred about 1 minute and 12 seconds, 12 to 15 seconds into the launch. Now, in the successful launch on the right-hand side of your screen, the booster rockets would not separate for perhaps another 50 seconds, past the 2-minute mark, until the launch was more than 2 minutes into flight. You can see back on October 30th, this same shuttle, one of 4, the Space Shuttle Challenger, disappeared on into outer space after its launch, and after jettisoning as scheduled its solid booster rockets. The one this morning became a ball of flame and then smoke trailing debris. Those of you who've been with us throughout our live coverage today, I know, have seen the slow motion of what happened this morning, but we want to show it again now. For one thing, we've had some calls and we've discussed among ourselves about the very important time, as Leo Krupp has pointed out to us from Los Angeles, before the big ball of flame, when it appears down on the lower left-hand solid booster rocket, some indication of trouble. That may be what you see when you go to this slow motion videotape. So let's take a look now at the slow motion videotape. Look in the center, slightly left lower part of your screen. 2 little indications of some difficulty with the solid rocket booster. Perhaps something seems to be wrong down there. 2 minor, let's say minor, 2 small explosions. Nothing in the way of explosion is minor when you have one of these launches, and then it just mushrooms out into this tremendous ball of fire. Leo Krupp in Los Angeles, you've watched this with us a number of times this afternoon. What are the first things that the NASA investigators are going to be looking for?
Well, I imagine the first thing they're going to be trying to do, Dan, is find out why.
Through the shuttle's main engines, and that appears to be the first flame. Is it in fact the first flame? Obviously, I don't know. Okay, let's roll a little bit more, and what you'll see will happen as it keeps going. The flame then, obviously, that very thin-skinned external tank with all that liquid hydrogen and oxygen is so volatile, so flammable, is just going to go. Keep going. And as the flame appears to be spreading, now the whole tank will go, but the boosters get thrown free. And then, as Peter, you've pointed out a number of times, they just go sent off in the wrong direction, but they are not exploding in any way. What we're talking about, obviously, that orange blob in the middle, the long sort of pencil-looking, I'm sorry, the long fat pencil, the crayon, is the external tank. And if that ruptures, then the boosters, those two white crayons on the side, would simply be sent on their way the wrong way, and they would go until they fizzle out, and then they go down into the ocean, and they are supposed to be recovered for another mission.
Well, Lynn, here's a note for you. We've had a report from Cape Canaveral that they found bits of the booster rockets. Now, is that normal? I thought they could be recovered intact.
You're quite right. It is not normal. They should be recovered intact because they do get reused. But there you see on the right what appears to be a perfectly normal rocket burn. Again, going the wrong direction. It's supposed to be attached to the shuttle and heading up or heading out. Instead, it appears to be heading down. But there does not appear to be any kind of I repeat, appear to be anything unusual about that. If there were an explosion within the tank, as we're speculating, it is possible that it could have affected a piece of one of the boosters, which may account for why there are pieces of the boosters. But I don't want to take this too far because it's dangerous without really knowing what happened.
Well,
but Peter, you're entirely right that if they find pieces of a booster, obviously the booster did not make it intact.
Well, I would like you to ask one question, and I couldn't agree with you more that getting too deep. We've only got about 15 minutes before NASA promises they're going to come and tell us something. But one of the European scientists, Mike Lee, told us earlier this morning, it speculated that the bad weather at the Cape, particularly the cold, that Arctic wind that pushed down right into the deep south in the last couple of days, may have had some effect on the main tank. Is that a consideration at least?
Sure, it has to be. Everything has to be a consideration because this has never happened before. So everything has to be taken into account.
Well, how about normal circumstances?
I saw the same pictures as you did this morning with the icicles surrounding the shuttle. The shuttle is not used to that, and in the past they've had a problem. They're worried that the ice is going to knock against the tiles during liftoff and maybe hurt some of the tiles. It was my understanding that they had teams in there knocking those icicles off so that they would be away from the fuel lines so that there could not be a problem. I don't know. Yes, of course you have to take everything into consideration.
I must tell you one other thing, which is a report only from Cape Canaveral, and it's really talking about the people on the search teams now, who've been out for a couple of hours. They say that while they found bits of the booster rockets, they have found no signs of life. Lynn, thank you very much for joining us. To remind you that this was the 10th flight for Challenger and the 25th of the entire shuttle program. And in this city, and it may be a reflection of what you're asking yourselves all over the country today, it has certainly been raised by those people we heard from in Western Europe, but that's in part because they have an unmanned space program, the efficacy of sending civilians or man into space generally. It has always been, in contrast to the Soviet space program for a long period of time, much more ambitious manned program. You will recall back in the 1950s when Sputnik, that thing the size of a grapefruit, orbited around and sent this nation into something of a deep shock, particularly the administration. It was determined to get ahead of the Soviets in the space program. And it was really that which led in large measure to the emergence of the Mercury astronauts, people like John Glenn and Alan Shepard, who we saw this morning, who 25 years later became American heroes a second time round when they became the subject of a very highly popular, I wouldn't say altogether highly popular, but certainly highly publicized movie called The Right Stuff. And on Capitol Hill today, as you heard,
brought to the attention of the nation the fact that they had a space program that was, if you will, based on feet of clay. As a result, they conducted the most sweeping investigation in the history of United States technology. There was much breast beating, much brow beating, but in the final analysis, NASA decided that it had to redesign its entire spacecraft, go to an entirely new oxygen system, if you will, before they could fly again. I'm not suggesting that this may take a total redesign of the space shuttle. There have been too many successful flights to date, but what I am suggesting is that right now, a NASA team, probably what they call a blue ribbon panel, but in this case with the top engineers, the top scientists that NASA can command, is being put together. We may even hear some announcement of that when NASA comes to the fore with a news conference now expectable in just about 7 or 8 minutes. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they announce at that time that a committee has been named by NASA from within itself to conduct an equally sweeping investigation. And it could be that before they're finished, the space shuttle may have to go through some redesign factors, but the likelihood right now, based on research being conducted at this minute at the Marshall Space Flight Center and here in California out at the Rocketdyne Division and the Space Divisions of Rockwell, based on that, the likelihood is that the problem this time is a far smaller signature, is far less in import than the one that caused the Apollo 1 fire, but it will be totally investigated. We can expect such a committee to be named, and shortly, and I'm sure that we, the public, will probably know more about what really did happen, thanks to the telemetry beamed down from space, probably know more than any of us can really handle in the not too far distant future. Analysis is going on now, Tom.
Thank you very much, Roy Neal, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena today. That's the only experience in glamorous business. You sit around in the pilot's lounge until it's time to strap up and then take off. Well, it's not that at all. It's a rigorous, demanding profession that involves a lot of the sciences, physics and otherwise, and also it's a demanding physical regimen. That is that they put in long days going through the various procedures. There's Krista McAuliffe, who was the school teacher. She was on a consolidated program, of course, preparing for this flight. Most NASA officials said, look, if you're in pretty good physical condition and you're generally alert, that you can get through this all right.
Is this brown or black? It's brown. It's brown.
This is your stuff.
Ellison Onizuka, who was there with her, as you can see in the background, the first Japanese-American to go up.
He doesn't know what that's.
He was scheduled to launch in '84, but he couldn't do that then. That's Judy Resnick that we just heard from her, looking very serious. But as I say, there was that mischievous side to her as well. Gregory Jarvis, payload specialist. That is people who work with that big Canadian arm in the background. Now they're gearing up. They get into all of this paraphernalia only for the takeoff. Then when they're in space, they're able to live pretty comfortably, actually, within the confines of the space shuttle itself. As Bob Bazell indicated earlier, the toilet is kind of tricky to operate. But all the indications were that everything was going to go okay.
Which computer am I plugging to? Let's see.
Ronald McNair is the black astronaut. He's a magna cum laude graduate of North Carolina A&T and a presidential scholar. He's one of America's first 4 black astronauts.
Try to keep us informed of where you are in the timeline also.
I've been in the cockpit of one of the space shuttles. What you do is crawl down into it from on top. It's relatively confined, but once they get up there again, as I indicate to you, they can move around a little bit, although for a 5 or 6 day period, it's close quarters. That is Krista McAuliffe, who's in the foreground here. And I think Gregory Jarvis, who is seated beside her.
It's got that little drawstring on it so you can tie it off.
Would you like one?
I need. Do you have an extra?
Yes, I do. Oh. Teachers are always prepared.
Thank you.
On liftoff, other astronauts have told me before that it's an exciting sensation because there's an awful lot of thrust that is developed, more than 2 million pounds on either side of you with those solid rocket boosters, but it's nothing that the human body can't withstand, even those bodies that are untrained, in effect, to the extreme force of G's. There you can see how close the quarters are. And that's where they were strapped in today, still in place. When the explosion occurred, that it appears to all who have looked at it, killed them all. Mr. McNair. 2 children and a wife, Cheryl.
Is all of Hughes on fishing in El Segundo?
Rhonda, you can request an MS transfer bag, which is like a pouch, a mailman's type bag. Hell, I don't know how strong those lockers are. I wouldn't trust my weight on them.
Get me up there, then I'll have to.
Communication system in Conneaut.
We've just received word that President Reagan will make his address live to the nation tonight at 5 p.m. That's in 1 hour from now, Eastern Standard Time.
I had a terrible set of events. I lived in Boston for 2 years and then went to
and you just start putting all your stuff on, and then we'll get the whole orbiter configured, and we'll give them each their bags, and then you know, while they're getting the flight deck ready to go home, and all of us will, you know, the 3 of us.
This is Ellison Onizuka, who is a 39-year-old mission specialist as well. He has 2 children that he leaves behind, we believe. He was a U.S. Air Force test pilot and winner of the Air Force Commendation Medal. Air Force test pilots, of course, are
familiar to anyone who's followed the space program.
One of the things that I hope to bring back into the classroom is to make that connection with the students that they too are part of history, that the space program belongs to them, and to try to bring them up with the space age.
These are other photographs of training of school teacher Krista McAuliffe. She tried to get herself in better physical condition, went through the medical tests, having been chosen from among more than 11,000 teachers selected for this flight. She posed proudly beside the Space Shuttle Challenger, went through that long, arduous preparation. Recall that Judy Resnick, the other woman aboard today's flight, had been waiting 6 years for her flight into space. This was her second flight. Now today, boarding the bus for the launch, school teacher McAuliffe and the other 6 Americans, looking so forward to what they were convinced would be another successful launch. 24 space shuttle launches, 56 American manned space launches, with never a death before. There were 3 deaths in 1967 on the pad, but that was before launch. Today's the first disaster in space flight for this country. Mrs. McAuliffe was a social studies teacher in Concord. And the other woman, as we mentioned, aboard with her, she was selected from the 11,000 teachers applicants. Now, Judy Resnick, who was the mission specialist, had been selected through a whole different process, part of the what we now call the routine process of selecting men and women as part of the space program. And Judith Resnick, the second American woman in space, Sally Ride had been the first. Judith Resnick talked about what it was like to be the second woman in space.
Is there anything that needs to be said about the second woman in space? U.S. woman?
I'm very comfortable flying with this crew. We have gotten along very well from the beginning. We work well together. We have a good time in training. I'm very comfortable with the whole mission in general, and I view myself as part of the team. There's 6 of us, and I have about 1/6 of the responsibility, and the other guys have about 1/6, and that's the way we intend to do it on orbit, and we're all very comfortable with that. And I'm very confident of their abilities, and I think they're very confident of my abilities in the areas that I have responsibilities, and I trust them in the areas that I don't know that much about to go do the right thing, and we have that mutual trust among us, and I think that will make for a good mission because we have a good crew.
What does Judith think about going to space?
Well, I'm eager to go.
A long time waiting?
I've been here for 6 years. I think it's about time, the right length of time to be at NASA and working in the system before you go fly. There are a lot of people who have waited longer for flights. There are some who have waited less time for flights. I'm very satisfied with where I am right now. I'm ready to go fly this mission with the rest of the crew, and I hope after the mission's over that NASA wants me to fly another one.
Judith Resnick, 36 years old, from Akron, Ohio, unmarried. She has a doctorate in electrical engineering. She's also a classical pianist. This was her second space mission after becoming the second American woman in space behind Sally Ride. This was to be her second mission in space. And if you say to yourself, well, what was it that these women do up there? What does the men do up there? This particular woman, this woman astronaut, this American hero, was trained to operate the shuttle's robot arm. Now, for those of you who have forgotten or perhaps haven't followed the space program too carefully, that once the space shuttle in normal launches, successful launches, once the solid rocket boosters separated out, the main fuel tank separated out, and the space shuttle itself got...
She knows where we're going to be standing, how busy it's going to be, where she can help, where we need our space, and she has learned an awful lot and become a team member.
Payload specialist Gregory Jarvis was an electrical engineer who joined the program only 2 years ago. He talked about the space vehicle.
Well, it's been very satisfying because you are close to the space. You don't get to do the ultimate trip, but you're close enough to the program that you really feel like you're contributing. And
finally, 36-year-old mission specialist Ronald McNair was a physicist. He became an astronaut in 1978 following work at the Hughes Research Laboratories. McNair planned to track Halley's Comet during the Challenger mission.
That comet exists now the way it did at the creation, origin of the universe.
McNair was the second black astronaut to fly in space. Ron Israel, Headline News.
Solid booster rocket, that right at this point there could have been a tearing when the rocket went into great acceleration, its fastest point. But of course that alluded to this a few minutes ago when they went through full power at about 1.
Well, the only thing I could think about with those kids in that auditorium and the trauma they must be going and what a shock it must be for them to watch something like that happen to their teacher. That's what I was thinking of.
I think maybe they are doing a little too many shuttles, so I wasn't really that shocked. If you keep going up, there's more reason for error, more room for error.
The shock is it just reminded me of a disaster of previous times of how the community would react, like the Hindenburg when that went up, and the human tragedy, the loss of life.
I think what bothers you about this is that this represents the epitome of the technology that our country has, and everything that we've ever put into space technology manifests itself in the shuttle program. And for something like this to go wrong, what do? You start from scratch again.
Whenever you hear about something like this, you always have some kind of shock because it's out of the ordinary, and you don't expect things like this to happen.
Once again, Kennedy Space Center, the flag at half-staff today. Of course, more people are killed in regular airplane accidents or in tornadoes, sometimes even in car accidents. And while we're moved...
Clearly see it must be Eastern Standard Time.
For most of the flight, 104%.
When the 10th flight for Challenger
65% shortly
began, and it drove towards orbit with everything absolutely normal.
Running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
One minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Well, there are no more words required to describe to you what happened today. There cannot be anyone in the country today who does not have some sense, and has perhaps not rushed to their television set to witness, either for the first time or on the many times since that you've had a chance to see it, what actually happened there today. We do have one little piece that we've talked a little bit earlier today about speculation. Dr. Max Faget, who is the head of the team that designed the shuttle and who does not work for NASA now, said he does not believe that anything about the cause of the explosion can be discerned on these tapes that we have been seeing on the air. And he says that based on what he has been seeing on television, there isn't any evidence that would help us pinpoint the cause of the explosion. It's very important because, in part because we have perhaps been on the air for some considerable period of time, there has been a tendency to speculate a little. So I just want to quote Dr. Faget there, who was one of the team that designed the shuttle. He does not believe that anything about the cause of the explosion can be discerned from any of the tapes that have been playing on the air. ABC's Lynn Scher at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or out in California at least, not at the Jet Propulsion Lab. Yes, Lynn?
Peter, I also just got some information about Max Faget, coincidentally, and it's my information that he has said he simply has no idea. He, of course, being the man, a man largely responsible for designing the shuttle. I wanted to add a couple of things, and it's along the same line. We've talked about, let's narrow it down, the three possibilities that could have caused this thing. One, that was one of the solid rocket boosters. Two, that it was one of the main engines. Let me show you on the model. Perhaps it was one of the two solid rocket boosters. Perhaps it was a main engine that simply let go and caused the fire, or perhaps it was the external tank itself that ruptured. I think the important thing to keep in mind, it has been pointed out to me, is that this was so catastrophic that it is probably not an engineering problem, i.e. these structures just don't fall apart like that, or they're certainly not meant to. There is no history to indicate that they would do that. Yes, we have seen that flame at about the midpoint or the lower third of the tank. Whether the flame started there and there was a rupture in the tank or a fuel line that caused it, or whether in fact that's a secondary reaction from an explosion in one of the engines or somewhere else, we simply don't know. And I think the quote you were reading from Dr. Faget is obviously to the point. One
Lynn,
final note. Yeah.
He also does say, having said that he can't see anything on the tape, he also say the flame observed between the shuttle and the external tank could be a fire inside the shuttle burning through the skin. Has anybody else suggested that to you?
Nobody has suggested that to me. That is one area that I haven't heard of. But the flames, sure, it could have started anywhere, but there are flames around the engine. There are flames around the edges of the solid rocket boosters. There is enough heat generated there that if any of the liquid hydrogen or oxygen were to escape from the main tank, that would obviously cause that kind of explosion. The only good news in all of this, and it's not such good news, but it may be helpful news, let's call it that, was pointed out to me that there is no time during a shuttle flight when there is more telemetry than during the ascent phase. In other words, while the shuttle is going up at exactly the time that it exploded, reams of material is coming down and going into the monitors and onto tapes and everything down at Mission Control in Florida and in Houston. If there is a way to analyze that data, they have a shot at it, because they have just about every bit of information that they need to know already in their memory banks.
Well, what's your own sense? Can they do it fast enough to satisfy a clearly anxious nation?
I don't think so, no. I think that it's going to be, a long time. I just spoke to another former shuttle astronaut who pointed out that this is such a stunning blow to the space program. Who knows when they will be able to figure it out.
We want to go actually a little farther ahead of this. The point that Dr. Faget is making is that liquid hydrogen explodes so quickly in contact with the air that in his view it's unlikely to be a leak in the external tank, and those are the external tanks that we saw subsequently going off into space. And it has such a thin skin that it would come apart. But all that white cloud we have been seeing after the explosion is most likely, he believes, the propellants from the external tank turning to snow, because the liquids, those of us who knew more about chemistry would know this, the liquids would crystallize as soon as they burst free of the tank. So what looks to us amateurs like smoke may well in some cases be snow. We are still waiting for NASA, which told us the news conference was going to occur at 4:15 Eastern Time. It is now 4:17. We've been talking about loss, and clearly the most important and pertinent and immediate loss today is of the 7 people on board. NASA not only loses a shuttle, which you heard Congressman George Brown describe at worth something slightly in excess of $1 billion, but also lost is a $100 million satellite that was to become an important part of NASA's shuttle communications network. And there was a smaller $10 million payload on board that was part of an experiment to study Halley's Comet, which, as you know, has now gone behind the sun and is not going to be seen, if it's seen at all, by many people in the country until sometime in March. To connect us with the rest
astronauts, she is a mission specialist, her specialty being electrical engineering, but who knows what she'll do when she gets in orbit. Judy, welcome. It's nice to have you.
Thank you.
One of the things we were talking about before is once these guys get up there and on orbit, they've got a very strange working day. It's a little bit different from what it's been in the past.
Well, today they're going to take it easy. The only strange part about it is when they go to sleep and when they get up. They will get about 8 hours of sleep every night, but that will start tonight, for example, at 7:30 our time, having them get up about 3:30 in the morning.
And that changes all week until it's earlier and earlier, right?
We gradually move the wake-up time a little bit earlier so that on the landing day they have enough time to get up and get all the things done that they need to do before they deorbit to land at Edwards at 9 o'clock Pacific time.
So those of us who are following it on Mission Control, if we're on astronaut time, we're getting up at 12, 1, 2, 3 in the morning and going to bed around dinner time.
That's right. We're more tired than they are.
The landing also, if they don't get their crosswind, it will be the first concrete runway landing. Is that correct?
At the present time, that is the plan.
While they're on orbit, we were talking before, one of the things you have studied has been the ARM, the remote manipulator system. What are they going to be doing different with the ARM this time when they're up there?
Well, once again, we're going to be picking up a small instrumentation package that will measure the contamination around the orbiter, and this package is housed towards the back part of the orbiter. We are not going to actually let go of the monitor. We're just going to move it around in a pre-programmed sequence to measure the atmosphere that the orbiter puts out as it moves through the orbit. On later flights, the remote manipulator arm will be used to take large satellites, for example, out of the cargo bay and put them into orbit. The orbiter will act much like a bus at that time, and the satellite will be actually getting off at its bus stop, so to speak. We get to the right place in the right time, and we'll pick it up with the arm, and we'll put it where we want to, let go, and then back the orbiter away and leave it there.
That's really the kind of routine use of the space shuttle that we've been talking about all along, at least that NASA has. Judy, thank you. We will be coming back for lots more conversations with you. And Frank, I believe we're coming up with the first acquisition of signal from the astronauts as they approach orbit.
Well, there's a bit of history for you, among other things. Lynn Scherr, who's covered space for...
That thrill turned into a horror of watching the space shuttle come apart in the skies. What's the latest from there, Steve, in terms of what the NASA scientists are going to tell us and when?
I wish I could preview it. We just don't know, Tom. They've been sliding this back about 5 minutes at a time for quite a while now. Jess Moore is going to conduct the briefing. Apparently, he's going to do it himself. Jess Moore has been running the manned space program. NASA is a little bit understaffed at the top right now because James Beggs, the administrator, is kind of on a leave of absence while he handles some legal problems. Jess Moore has been running it as the associate director for manned spaceflight, which means he's in charge of those who are associated with the shuttle program. And earlier, before any of this took place, he was the one who was conducting the briefings to say that, well, there was a problem with the weather here or there, or in the case of the delay that rolled the thing over until through the weekend, there was a problem with a mechanical device, a door handle of all things, that they couldn't quite pull out because it has to be replaced before they can lift off. And Jess Moore was the one who was in charge. He's in transit. He's on his way to assume administration of the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and from now on that'll be his post, and there'll be another person assigned here to take care of the manned spaceflight program. But he will conduct the briefing, and I'd like to be able to suspect that the reason they've been putting it back is perhaps they are trying to collate and gather together little bits and pieces of information which would allow him to give us as definitive a look as we've had yet as to, if not why it happened, certainly what happened. And the briefing is about to begin, and the speaker is Hugh Harris, the spokesman.
Hey, Delaney?
Yes, Tom.
All right, here we are now.
As I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, the space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, These searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. The dedicated crew members of Challenger are Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialist Dr. Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Dr. Ronald McNair. And payload specialists on board were Krista McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis. All early indications in the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
Mr. Moore has time for just a couple of questions from each center before returning to the effort in investigating this tragedy. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and your affiliation. And we'll start right here with Jacqueline Bolden from Channel 6.
There were some reports that the shuttle perhaps rose a little slower than in previous launches, and there seemed to be a loud noise, and then the noise kind of backed off, and then a rush of noise again. Did you get any reports from anyone else that this seemed different from the people who either experienced it, saw it here live?
I have not heard any reports at all relative to that effect that you just described. None whatsoever.
Okay. Up here in the third row, Michael.
My name's Kevin Hamilton from WGIR in Manchester. The entire Teacher in Space program was designed to introduce more people, specifically youngsters, to the space program. This obviously is not the introduction you intended to make. What do you think the effect, the long-term impact that this is going to have on the youngsters that you were hoping to attract?
Well, I think we'll have to address that as time goes on. And again, I think today, the events of the day makes it much too early for me to speculate on the long-term impacts.
Okay, Al Selstead from Baltimore Sun in the first row.
Mr. Moore, at this time, do you have any estimate of how much liquid fuel was in the external tank at the time of the explosion, and how much explosive power, say in terms of TNT, that remaining liquid fuel might have been equal to?
No, sir, not at this time. You realize what we've been doing since 11:40 this morning is we immediately pulled our senior management together in this program, and I formed an interim board to ensure that all relevant data to this event would be impounded and would be made accessible to the investigative people that will go and take a look at it. I can't answer your specific questions relative to how much fuel was on board at this point in time. The board, when it's formally reported by the administrator, formally formed by the acting administrator, I'm sure will go into those kinds of questions, but I can't answer it right now.
Okay, we're going to take one more question here before going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Here in the right opposite you, Jackie.
Peter Van Sant from CBS News. We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of any problems at all with any of with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, heater box, that had about 1/4 of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired, and everybody, all the experts in the program, took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time.
Wait for the microphone. I have to have the microphone.
There was no damage to any tank, or this arm did not strike any tank as far as you know?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, we're going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Just a couple of questions.
Yeah, this is the Johnson Space Center. We have a question from Paul Reeser, Associated Press.
Yes, Mr. Moore. Was there any debris of any description recovered by the vessels, and if so, what was it?
We do not have any detailed debris reports at this point in time. That certainly is something that we're looking at, and we will be impounding all the debris that we recover, and we've set up plans here to store that debris so that the investigating group can go in and look at that and assess that in great detail. I do not have any detailed reports right now on debris.
Okay. Bruce Nichols.
Mr. Moore, with all the delays that you experienced last week, the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there? And who made the final decision to go or no go?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
We're going to the Marshall Space Flight Center for a couple of questions.
Martin Berkey with Huntsville Times. Can you tell me what this does to the schedule on down the line, including the launch at Vandenberg?
No, I'm not prepared to do that. What I have done is basically suspend operations for a few days till we can sit down and assess this. And, you know, we're obviously not going to pick up any flight activity until we fully understand what the circumstances were relative to this morning's launch. So in the interim, near-term time, we basically suspended operations until we get a handle on what our problems were this morning.
Nick Miller, WAFF Television in Huntsville. What part will Marshall Space Flight Center play in the investigation, since the propulsion system was the responsibility of the Space Flight Center here?
Well, they obviously have to play a very strong role in the investigating what happened this morning. As you know, the Space Shuttle program is built around a team effort, not only involving the Marshall Center, but also the Kennedy Space Center and the Johnson Space Center. All of the elements have different responsibilities, and clearly Marshall has the propulsive responsibilities on the shuttle. They will play a very dominant role, as will the other three centers I mentioned, as well as anybody that is contributing to the overall program and has some relevant information to add will certainly play a part.
Okay, we're moving to Washington for questions from NASA headquarters. Okay, there is a problem with our audio circuits to Washington. We are going to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena.
Bill Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times. Mr. Moore, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the appointment of this interim review board and said that it would be making statements from time to time. Not to put any adverse interpretations on this, it sounds a little bit like a news blackout, and I'm wondering if your objective is to consolidate information, what will be the point of issue of all those announcements in the future? And are other people not involved in that review board forbidden to talk?
Well, let me correct your statement. First of all, I said that I had appointed an interim review board. That interim review board is composed of the senior members of the NASA team here to take immediate actions on impounding data. The acting administrator is expected to appoint a formal review board very shortly, and it will be left up to that review board in order to determine its progress reports in terms of their findings. What we have done here today is to move very quickly so that all relevant data could be impounded and all actions that are needed to be taken in order to preserve as much information as we can on the circumstances of this morning can be preserved. And that's the nature of the work that I've implemented today, and I expect a formal board to be established very, very shortly, within the next day or so, by the acting administrator.
This is Roy Neal, NBC News. Jess, you've said, I believe, that future flights are temporarily frozen. The United States space program, as a result, is at a halt. Now, based on your experience, how long would you estimate that this investigation will take? 6 months, a year, before you get back in business?
Roy, it is, as you know, it is very difficult to estimate that time. It's going to be a function of what the board finds were the difficulties today and what corrective actions have to be taken before we feel confident and feel safe to fly again. And I clearly am not in a position to speculate today the length of time involved in making that determination. It will be done just as quickly as we possibly can, but also as prudently as we possibly can and as thoroughly as we possibly can.
One more question from JPL.
Bill Hines again. I've got to follow up on that first question of mine. I understand now that there will be announcements made after the permanent board is appointed. Is that correct?
There will be an announcement, I'm sure, of the members of the permanent board, yes. I believe that will be correct, and then I think that board will determine its rate of reporting based on the progress of its findings.
Okay, we're going next to the Washington NASA headquarters.
Are there any indications of sabotage or attack on the shuttle?
Okay, here.
I'm sorry, we didn't read that question. And while they're repairing that circuit to Washington, we'll go to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland.
Mark Weaver, WBAL Radio in Baltimore. Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Ken Gerald from WDVM in Washington. Were there any unusual weather conditions aloft or any unusual weather conditions during the launch?
None that we observed that I recall. We did put up some weather balloons early this morning. We did look at load conditions as we normally do, and the winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge, and we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Mr. Moore, I.J. Hudson from WRC-TV. Has it become a problem that you have been too good in the past, that the American people have seen flawlessly perform missions on TV almost routinely, and that something like this happens all of a sudden, it hits home even harder?
Well, I don't know how to answer your question specifically. We always strive in every flight that we perform to be as reliable and as safe as we possibly can, and to do everything that we can to ensure that the vehicle and the systems are all ready to fly. Flight safety is our #1 priority in the Space Shuttle program. And certainly when you see an event like this morning, we are going to have to do a very detailed assessment of the set of circumstances to try to understand what occurred, and we will then in turn assess the impacts from that to determine where we go in the future.
I think you can hear it over the speaker.
Okay, back here at the Kennedy Space Center, we only have time for a couple more questions. Jay Barbary from NBC News in the front row here.
Jess, I would like to know if you know what happened to Challenger. Can we assume that it was consumed in the explosion? And can you tell us specifically what you know now that the recovery crew has recovered in the impact area?
I have not gotten a briefing, Jay, on what the recovery team has found at this point in time. And I have basically looked at the NASA Select photos and so forth that you did, and all I can say is that it appeared from those photos that there was an explosion. And that's about all I can say at this point in time.
Okay, we have time for only one more question, and James Fisher from the Orlando Sentinel has had his hand up a long time.
Jess, I realize this is a rather forward-thinking question, but what is the situation with the Rockwell plant about the possibility for ordering another shuttle? Has the assembly line been shut down? What's the situation with that?
Well, as we've discussed in the past, we are manufacturing structural spares for an Orbiter system, and that manufacturing process is continuing. We are also buying spares for the current fleet that we have, and there is a production capability there if and when it's decided that that's the next step we want to do, is to move forward and do that. So I think the bottom line answer to your question is yes, that is a possibility, that we could implement a production capability for another orbiter if that were decided to be the thing to do.
Okay, I'm sorry to have to wind this up now. Mr. Moore has to get back immediately. As you know, he's been here since very early in the morning, and there's much to be done. Thank you all.
Thank you.
That's the news conference from the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, where we heard Jess Moore with the first definitive, although not wide-ranging, reaction of NASA to what happened today at about 1 minute and 30 seconds, as he indicated, after liftoff of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It blew up. He would not speculate at all on what may have happened. He would not even say whether he believed that the shuttle itself, that is the aircraft, the space aircraft, was consumed in the explosion or whether it went down intact. And then we believe if it did that, in fact, it would have broken up when it hit the water. He would not even comment on that. He did say that all tapes...
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Half an hour after the explosion, a serpentine trail of white smoke. It was twisted by the upper wind, and that smoke remained in the cold, clear sky, marking the path of the shuttle's wreckage. The explosion occurred about the time the shuttle was to enter a period of maximum aerodynamic pressure. Wind and other atmospheric conditions placed the maximum force on the outside of the space vehicle. And now what happened in slow motion detail. You'll want to look first for what may have been a couple of little vapor indications of flame. You can begin to see them shortly. This is about 60 seconds into the launch, if you will, and then the larger explosion. See what appears to be vapor flames at the base in the left-hand side of the screen. Now the main fuel tank begins to ignite and explode. As we wait for President Reagan to address the American people, you will note in the upper right-hand quarter of your screen what appears to be an entire, or almost entire, there it is, upper quarter of the screen, piece of what is believed to be the Wright solid rocket fuel booster. Now, when Leo Krupp was saying a few minutes ago that those boosters are supposed to parachute into the sea and are possibly recoverable, you can see how that large a piece of debris, if it can be found, might indeed be very valuable in the investigation. Now, as we await, that's what happened this morning, both in real-time videotape and the slow-motion videotape. And as we await President Reagan's talk to the American people, you may want to ponder a poem called High Flight by John Gillespie McGee, Jr., a 19-year-old American volunteer with the Royal Canadian Air Force who was killed in training December 11th, 1941. And he wrote a poem called High Flight. And it reads, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, up the long, delirious, burning blue. I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God." In the wake of the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger at Cape Canaveral, Florida, this morning, shortly before noon Eastern Time, we take you now to the White House in Washington for a talk by the President of the United States.
15 seconds. 10 seconds. Stand by, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista Mikaloff. We mourn their loss as a nation together. The families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace that special spirit that says, give me a challenge and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
Live from the White House in Washington, D.C., the President of the United States with a talk to the American people on this day when 7 of their fellow Americans, 7 individual and unique human beings, apparently perished in the fireball that became the Space Shuttle Challenger. Those heroes were the commander of the Space Shuttle flight today, Major Francis Dick Scobie, 46 years old, Auburn, Washington, hometown, married, father of 2 children. This was his second mission and his first command of a shuttle mission. He is a retired major from the United States Air Force. Francis Scobie was the shuttle commander today. His pilot, riding in effect second seat, Mike Smith, 40 years old from Beaufort, North Carolina. Married, the father of 3 children. This was his first mission. He's a commander by rank in the United States Navy, a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. Among the other heroes aboard, Mission Specialist Judith Resnick, 36, hometown Akron, Ohio. Unmarried, she had a doctorate in electrical engineering, was a classical pianist. This was her second mission. She was the second American woman in space, second behind Sally Ride. This was her second shuttle mission. She was trained to operate the shuttle's robot arm. Mission Specialist Ronald McNair, among the heroes, 35 years old, Lake City, South Carolina, his hometown. The father of 2 children, married, a doctorate in physics from MIT. This was his second flight. Mission Specialist Ellison Onizuka, 39 years old, from Hawaii. Married, father of 2 children, an Air Force colonel. This also was his second flight. His first flight was a secret one for the Defense Department some months back. Payload specialist and employee of Hughes Aircraft, connected to NASA, Greg Jarvis, 41 years old, married, made his home in Spring Valley, New York, an electrical engineer. He was bumped from 2 previous flights, but was finally getting a chance to go, and oh, how he looked forward to it. His job was to conduct experiments on how liquids behave in the weightlessness of space. And Susan Krista McAuliffe, 37-year-old social studies teacher, born in Boston, Massachusetts, high school teacher in Concord, New Hampshire, a teacher since 1970, and was selected from 11,146 teachers from all across the country who had applied to be NASA's first citizen in space. The first strictly citizen in space she was to have been. Married, her husband's an attorney, had 2 small children. She was to have taught later in the week 2 15-minute classroom lessons from space. Those, the 7 Americans who perished today aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger in a ball of flame. In the California desert north of Los Angeles is the Rockwell International Facility where the Space Shuttle Challenger was put together. CBS News correspondent Jerry Bowen has been there for reaction.
This is where the Challenger was built, Rockwell International in the Mojave Desert at Palmdale, California. Over the lunch hour today, the people who had put the Challenger together sat in stunned disbelief as they watched their spaceship on the videotape replays, exploding over and over again.
When the word started coming out, people were really down. Emotions were few people around the plant crying. People just felt really bad because of something they built, and they really were happy to see it go and stuff. And when that came around, everybody was really down about it.
And I feel sorry for all the things that happened over there, and I'd like to tell the families and everybody else how sorry we are.
Crushed. It's very hard to understand that you work on something and have so much pride and know that it happened and that there's nothing really you can do but just the pride of knowing that you worked on it.
Sorrow, wounded pride, utter helplessness. The feelings of the space-age workers who helped the Challenger rise from the California desert. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
And now, as it happened, videotape from this morning's tragedy and explosion in space. This was the 56th manned space launch for the United States.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And the flaming debris got smaller and smaller as it rained for 45 minutes into the Atlantic Ocean just southeast of the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Now in slow motion videotape, the critical scenes just before and during the explosion as the orbiter shuttle rides on its own liquid fuel tank and with the solid booster rockets on the sides. The catastrophic explosion left Mission Control in Houston stunned. At a news conference this afternoon, the first official word from NASA since the disaster, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration said simply and directly it did not know what had happened. For CBS News in New York, Dan Rather with Bruce Hall, CBS News at Cape Canaveral, Florida. We'll have full coverage of what happened today and reaction to it on the CBS Evening News later. And shortly, coming up next, in many of these stations, your early local news. For now, good day.
This is CBS.
Resnick. It's a pretty tough program. Were you prepared for this, for the physical difficulty of it?
Well, it's not really so difficult physically. It's a lot of new things, but they lead you through it by the hand. This is a demonstration of
now, wait a minute. That doesn't look like a lot of fun for a Saturday afternoon to me. I don't know about you, but...
Well, you have to learn how to survive in case you have to get out of an airplane in a parachute, and they teach you step by step how to fall, how to be dragged. That's the impact you feel if you go through an ejection seat, and it's really not as bad as it looks. They show you how to fall into the water by, instead of letting you fall the first time, they let you slide down a slide wire. Like I say, they break you into it gradually.
Were you a tomboy when you were a kid?
No.
You weren't, and you took to this right away. You like it?
It's fun.
What's the best part about being an astronaut?
Everything.
You just like it all?
Yes.
You get to exercise your training, electrical engineering, and expand your knowledge enormously, I would think.
Yes, I think the best part technically is that it's a very well-rounded approach to science and technology, and we get to do a little bit of everything and state-of-the-art, and it's always a challenge.
What happens when you meet a man who's not in the space program and doesn't know who you are, and you say, I'm an astronaut? Does he say, yeah, you're too cute to be an astronaut. Come on, little lady, you can't be an astronaut.
I just tell him I'm an engineer.
You don't tell him you're an astronaut?
Not unless he asks.
You really, you mean when you meet people for the first time? What about the whole business about social relationships? Does it make it, are some men threatened by the fact that you're an astronaut?
I don't know. If they are, they're probably not my friends.
Yeah. Judy Resnick, she would have been 37 years old in April. She's a classically trained pianist from Akron, Ohio. She loved the space program more than I can describe for you here today, and really loved going up into space. I had an enthusiastic letter from her not too long ago. She was saying that she was hoping I could come down and watch this one because she was sure it was going to go off on schedule. We used to have a running dialogue about whether NASA could keep to its schedule or not. She was a absolutely wonderfully dedicated astronaut, and it's a great loss to her family and, of course, to the country as well. It just really is an example of the kind of people that you have in the astronaut program. They are so gifted in so many ways. A PhD in electrical engineering, she was an enthusiastic gardener, she was a classical pianist, and despite her protestations that she couldn't do things better than some of the men, all the men told me that when she operated that big Canadian arm at the back of the payload, she had a great touch, that she had real dexterity. It may have been a result of her piano training, but at any rate, it is a great loss for everybody. We have now a schematic that we can show you that we will superimpose, as it were, over some of the pictures that we saw earlier today. These are the actual pictures, and then the schematic, as you can see, lays over so you can get a better sense of what we're talking about. Could we put that back up there again? Okay, fine. Anyhow, we're watching it now begin to blow up, and as you can see, the shuttle itself was on the bottom. The two solid rocket boosters were on either side, and the external tank is what appeared to come apart, although it's, I must emphasize that Jess Moore from NASA, who knows a great deal more about this than I do, refused to speculate based on those pictures. He's looked on them, he's looked at them, he's listened to all of us as we have made our observations today that it appeared to be a problem with the external tank, and he refused to get into that speculation, as well as he should not get into it, because after all, we want the best kind of investigation to go forward. Bob Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, right now. Bob, what are they saying out there about the nature of the investigation?
Well, the nature of the investigation isn't something that's being conducted here. This is the headquarters for unmanned spaceflight. However, one of the things that was interesting here is that so many of us who cover space regularly were here because of the Uranus mission of the Voyager spacecraft. And even the most veteran, hardened, experienced space reporter, there was just such a state of shock here among people who had seen so many space launches one after another to see what had happened today. When you're talking about the external fuel tank, and we're just speculating here as we have been all day long, obviously that was what exploded. Yeah. The question is whether it was the first thing to explode and whether it was the thing that initiated the explosion, and I guess that's the key question, because when we do look at those pictures, there's no question that that huge barrel of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, one of the most explosive combinations that human beings can put together, did go up and annihilate everything that had been left of the space shuttle. There's no question about that. The question is what initiated it. One of the things that will certainly be looked at in the investigation, and I'm not at all suggesting that this is what happened, but one of the things that will be examined in the investigation is that there are what NASA calls pyrotechnics. There are explosives on board the shuttle which are designed to blow it up. Now, there are hundreds of safety devices to keep those things from going off accidentally, but there is a man called the range safety officer whose duty it is to watch the shuttle, and in case it starts to go way off course and approach a populated area, he presses a button that would cause the shuttle to blow up. Now, those pyrotechnic devices are one of many, probably hundreds or even thousands of things that they're looking at as a possible malfunction. So, as Jess Moore said before, just from looking at that tape, all that you can see is that there was an explosion. You can't see what caused it, and it's probably going to take them an awful long time. One of the things that was interesting to me, having watched so many launches and looking at it, is that there wasn't a single indication of anything going wrong whatsoever. There was talk about the launch looking slow and everything, but if we've done earlier in the day, if you play it back next to normal launches, in fact, it wasn't slow. It has to do with camera angles. There was talks about funny noise, but that has to do with the wind condition. It was a cold day, so that it would have sounded much different to anybody who was there than it would on a normal Florida humid afternoon. There was no indication whatsoever, because if there had been, they would have radioed it to the crew. There would have been some evidence of it in the conversation. The only thing there was the permission for Dick Scobie, the commander, to go ahead to full throttle, his acknowledgement of that command, and then apparently as he just was going to full throttle, there was the explosion. So it's going to take quite an investigation to find out. At this point, there are no clues whatsoever. Tom?
Thanks very much, Bob Bazell, who, as he indicated, he's watched a good many of those, and they are magnificent sights on takeoff, as they were today, as a matter of fact. In the original flight, I remember a man saying it's a real pant flapper. You have no sense of what it's like on takeoff, the sheer raw power of the space shuttle and its attached propellant systems, until you're there and can feel it, as you actually can, as it sweeps across the Cape, the sound and the reverberations on takeoff. And it's a sight of utter majesty. And then today, that sight of utter majesty turned into a sight of utter horror. John Palmer's in New York now with additional information on this national tragedy, which has been going on now for almost 6 hours. John Palmer.
Yes, Tom, a national tragedy it is, a very sad day, and another sad statistic. A total of 11 children now have apparently lost at least one of their parents as the result of the explosion and the downing of the Space Shuttle Challenger, a catastrophic fire that blew apart the Space Shuttle just about a minute and a half after it took off. A few minutes ago, the Associate Director of NASA and the head of the Houston Space Center, in that very brief announcement and took a few questions down at the Cape, he said that the space program, had experienced a national tragedy, and he said there was no evidence the crew had survived. It's now after sundown in that search area, about 18 miles off the coast from Cape Canaveral, and as Jess Moore told us about 45 minutes ago, they have found no evidence, no debris, and certainly no sign of any survivors whatsoever. Jess Moore announced that he has formed an interim board to investigate, to review the facts right immediately, and to impound all information, all computer data, to get ready for another more formal board that will really look into the cause to see what happened. He said he would not speculate on the cause of the explosion because he said it was just too early, and as Tom just mentioned, he said that he was not going to speculate on the basis of those tragic pictures we see of about a minute and a half into the flight, the explosion there of the Space Shuttle. Again, he said there were no reports of any debris recovered. He was asked if there was any pressure whatsoever to get this particular shuttle off the ground. It had been delayed several days. It was delayed again today a couple of hours because of the freezing temperatures there and because of some icicles. Its predecessor, the Columbia, had been delayed for 7 days. They had planned 15 different space shuttles throughout this year of 1986. Obviously, they're not going to make that schedule, and there was even some doubt because of the delays of the last two shuttles that they were going to be able to make it. Moore said that all he could say is, obviously, from his observation and from ours and from everyone's, there was an explosion. He said, for now, the space program is suspended. He said there were no unusual weather conditions whatsoever. He said they sent up the usual airplanes early in the morning. They sent up weather balloons. It has been noted, though, that the jet stream was unusually far to the south in the last 24 hours, moving down over central Florida at about an altitude of 7 to 9 miles. The speed of the jet stream of the winds there clocked at about 100 miles an hour this morning. It was well below freezing. That doesn't mean that this perhaps had anything whatsoever to do with the tragedy that occurred, but it was a low of 25 for several hours overnight at Cape Canaveral, and that came up at about 10 o'clock in the morning to about 32 degrees, and the launch went off at 11:38 Eastern Time, the explosion following about a minute and a half later. There will be, of course, no State of the Union address tonight. The President, addressing the nation a short while ago from the Oval Office, stated, of course, that he wanted to come and talk about the state of the nation, but because of the tragedy, he said he was pained to the core, he and Mrs. Reagan pained to the core, that this was a day of national mourning. He said of the astronauts, they had a hunger to explore the universe. And, of course, he had those comments, those very poignant, very sad comments to the school children. Literally thousands of school kids all across this country were waiting in their classrooms to see this liftoff because the teacher, Christy McAuliffe, was taking off and was going to give exactly 2, I think it was, lessons from outer space. That's the situation now, kind of a wrap-up to the point. Again, it's after dark, and we couldn't expect really many more developments out of that search area. Let's go back now to Washington and Tom Brokaw.
Thank you very much, John Palmer. All manner of little tidbits of information coming our way. Governor Bob Graham, the governor of Florida, who has witnessed a number of those shuttle launches, was on a campaign tour today announcing his candidacy for the Senate, and he saw the takeoff and then the explosion from his airplane as he was flying over Florida. And about the president's message to the school children of America, it's very easy for those of us who are grown-ups to be kind of jaded about the space program. I recall vividly a friend of mine, a grown-up, who was watching a launch of a shuttle and turned to his wife and said, "Oh, it's another boring space launch." When his son, who was about 12 years old at the time, turned to him and said, "Hey, that's my future that you're talking about." And that's what the administration obviously had hoped would be an important part of this mission, that the youngsters of this country would think about that as their future. And nowhere was there more attention being paid to this shuttle launch today than in Concord, New Hampshire, the home of Christy McAuliffe. She was a school teacher there of third graders, but these were high school kids watching from an auditorium. The unalloyed joy of high school students with a kind of unofficial holiday as they watched what appeared to be the successful takeoff of the Challenger with Christy McAuliffe on board. And then the realization that something terrible was wrong.
Would everybody please go back to class at this time? We're asking all students to leave.
The best and worst, of course, of live television coverage coming together there in that auditorium as we were all able to watch what happened to what turned out to be their friend and then 6 other people that we cared about as a nation, the astronauts, as the shuttle blew up. And we were all suspended for a time between a state of belief and disbelief, not quite sure what we were seeing could in fact happen, because we have come to expect so much from high technology. But then the slow realization that in fact that our worst fears now were being realized. I will tell you that as a journalist who's covered the space program for a long time, that's been at the back of the mind of a lot of us. Maybe one of these will blow up on the pad or blow up in the sky someday and we have to watch it, but we always kind of put it at the back of our mind, never quite believing that it would happen. The astronauts who were involved in today's flight were interviewed before they went off about their feelings and their thoughts. most of them, of course, not expressing fears because they're not built that way, frankly. Here's what some of them had to say about what lay ahead, they thought.
Dr. McNair, first of all, this is your second flight. Can you give us any perspective on what it's been like for you training this time as opposed to last time, or your sense of anticipation this time as opposed to last time?
Well, starting with my sense of anticipation, I would say it's greater this time than the first, simply because I know how great it is, how nice it is, and how much fun it is, and how fascinating the entire experience is. Training the second time around, I would have to say, is a little easier. A lot of it you've done already. It's a matter of refreshing. I do have some new payloads that I have to start at ground zero with and learn, but having done it really has its advantages. But I do look forward to this, and it's as challenging. One cannot get laxed about it, approach it with the same amount of caution as the first or any time, but overall it's not as taxing.
Well, Mr. Jarvis, you are finally going to get to go up. You must, in addition to the fact that you're going to be doing a lot of things for your company, you must be, as an individual, be fairly charged up at this point.
I've been charged up since last March, and so this is kind of a culmination of a dream come true.
Well, what do you look forward to after this, Colonel? You've got a couple of flights. You'll have a couple of flights under your belt after you get back from this one. What's your goal after this?
Well, I hope to stay with the space program. Certainly fly more missions. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and I expect to stay with the program. Looking forward, like I said, to more missions and some involvement to future programs downstream. So I enjoy the space program. I'm very intrigued by the challenge it offers, and I look forward to staying with it as long as I can.
Is it possible for you to describe the way you describe your anticipation of the mission at this point? You must be excited as well as ready, I would suppose.
Well, I am excited, and I guess I look at it like I look at flying new airplanes back in my career. You know, you prepare as much as you can for it, and knowing that the real thing is going to probably be somewhat different than what the simulator is. But I think what I'm really looking forward to is just the experience of doing the ascent and seeing all the things that everyone comes back and talks about that they see while they're on orbit, watching the crew work together. You know, we've worked a long time now, 9 months or so, putting this whole flight together and watching everything happen, hopefully close to the way we've planned it. And I'm sure there'll be some problems to take care of along the way, which will be a challenge, and be able to come back and say I've done it, and hopefully go do it again quite a few times.
Both Chris McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis fit very well into the crew, and the things that they're doing, I think, are assets to the space program. And if they're assets to the space program and they're getting people interested in space and getting them to expect to fly in space and space is in their future, then I think it's good for the country to do that. And if it's good for the country, then they ought to be flying. The people that fly that are good for the country and good for science ought to be there.
Dick Scobie, the Air Force major who was the commander of this space shuttle flight, the last words that we heard from him, of course, were go for full throttle. He's a retired major in the U.S. Air Force, 46 years old. He would have been 47 years old on May 19th, and other members of that astronaut crew, in addition to Christa McAuliffe. We want to remind our stations once again that we will have continuous coverage here on NBC. NBC News will provide continuous coverage of this national tragedy throughout the early evening, and then there will be a special report tonight at 10 Eastern Time as well. But for those of you who want to return now to your local programming, you may feel free to.
First man in space said it best today when he commented it was a day he hoped would never come.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
The 25th shuttle flight lifted off at 10:36 this morning after 3 delays that began yesterday morning when a handle on a hatch couldn't be removed, followed by strong winds that postponed the flight until this morning. This morning, another delay, this time icicles that formed because of the cold temperatures. The takeoff was uneventful. Then 1 minute and 15 seconds into flight, it happened.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
A huge blast enveloped the spaceship in flames 9 miles above the Atlantic Ocean. Debris could be seen falling to Earth as booster rockets rooster-tailed through the Florida sky. The crash site was 18 miles downrange from the launch. Paramedics parachuted into the area, hoping to find survivors. NASA reported this afternoon all on board were lost.
Thousands of spectators ringed the launch site at liftoff. What began as a joyous occasion ended in shock and disbelief when the explosion lit up the morning sky. Teacher Krista McAuliffe's parents were among the startled crowd. They had traveled to Florida to see their daughter set a milestone in space travel. Krista was chosen from 11,000 candidates to be the first private citizen to fly on a shuttle.
In all, 7 lost their lives in this tragic accident. The crew members aboard Challenger were Francis Dick Scobie, Air Force Major born in Washington State. He was the commander. Michael Smith was the pilot, age 40, U.S. Navy, born in North Carolina. Judy Resnick, astronaut, 36-year-old, Ph.D., born in Akron, Ohio. Ronald McNair, another Ph.D., 35 years old, born in Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison Onizuka, Major, U.S. Air Force, age 39, born in Hawaii. 41-year-old Gregory Jarvis, born in Detroit. All crew members, and then the special passenger aboard the shuttle flight, Krista McAuliffe, age 37, school teacher, and mother from Concord, New Hampshire.
NASA, of course, is a civilian operation with very close ties to the government and the military. Today's accident, the first one to actually occur in space. And although the shuttle took off from Cape Canaveral, Florida, most know that it is controlled once launched from the Mission Control Center in Houston. That is where the Johnson Space Center is located. News Star correspondent Dan O'Rourke is there in Houston now with more on today's explosion. Dan?
Thank you, Roger. I'm standing in the building where just a few days ago the 7 astronauts who died today, the 6 astronauts and the teacher, were training in that shuttle mock-up right behind me. You come to a place like this and you share the sense of numbness that you get wherever you go in NASA today. A sense of numbness and yet a sense of freedom. The tour groups around NASA still welcome to walk around and enjoy, if they can, the Johnson Space Center. There was a press conference here, Roger, about an hour ago. During that time, the Space Shuttle program was indefinitely suspended while NASA searches for some kind of clue, some answer about what happened today. There's no official word from the former astronauts we have spoken to and the technicians. It's believed from NASA that some problem in the main engine itself actually touched off that explosion this morning, but the answers themselves may take weeks or months.
Dan, we are seeing now the picture once again. This, of course, Houston is an astronaut-built community. Most of the astronauts live in suburbs there. Any indication how families are being comforted in the astronaut community?
Well, we have chosen not to interrupt them in their shock or their grief, Roger, but we do know that memorial services, several of them, are planned in this part of Houston, the east side, where most of the astronauts, as you suggest, do live. We are seeing more of the signs, the rituals of grief in Houston than in elsewhere. With the memorial services, we drove down here from our news station, and everywhere you'd go down the freeway, the American flag, the Texas flag, every flag you would see would be at half-staff. So here, more than in most places, because the astronauts do train here and they do live here, we're seeing the signs of grief and the signs of respect. Roger?
Dan O'Rourke joining us from Houston. Thank you for your observations from the Johnson Space Center. Jennifer?
President Reagan decided that the first private citizen in space should be a teacher. 37-year-old Krista McAuliffe was chosen last summer to represent that teaching profession. Today's Challenger launch was to be the realization of her dream to teach in space, a dream that began last July.
Krista McAuliffe, live from the Challenger.
This excited, nervous school teacher is polishing the lesson she will teach from outer space.
Here, so I can explain to the kids that everything has to be held down because otherwise...
School children from all over the country will tune in on public television. Quite a change from a year ago, when our biggest audience was the social studies class at Concord High School in New Hampshire. McAuliffe became one of America's best-known teachers when she was picked from more than 11,000 applicants to be the first private citizen to get a ride on the shuttle.
I thought there was never going to be any more excitement. I mean, I could never peak any higher than I had on July 19th, and it just keeps building.
She hopes her trip is going to spread the idea that space is for everyone, and especially the students in today's classrooms.
Oh, that's great! I love it!
The Koloff had to become a student all over again, learning how to be an astronaut, where a sleek T-38 jet can serve as the study hall.
It was wonderful. Broke the sound barrier, and he let me fly for a while.
There were many lessons to be learned, fighting fires and driving the emergency escape vehicle.
There are a lot of students back at Concord High School who would love to have that opportunity.
She has become a hero back in Concord, and her husband has become a space enthusiast.
If I could nudge her aside and climb aboard, I think it'd be a fight.
And there's also a little competition from daughter Caroline.
I think it's neat to go into outer space.
This doesn't seem possible.
It was an emotional experience as she watched the launch of the shuttle last October.
It's beautiful!
She thinks it will be even more beautiful when she can share the experience with the nation's school children. Bruce Hall, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
Students at Concord High School in New Hampshire had gathered this morning to see one of their teachers make history. The scene in the school auditorium at the time of liftoff was one of total jubilation.
Shocked, very shocked.
Why? What's your initial reaction?
Well, I felt as if my whole body blew up inside when I saw that. And I can just never be as shocked as I am now.
The gathering was immediately dismissed. Students ordered back to class. The day of joy that was expected at that high school was not to be.
The Challenger explosion came as a shock to an Oklahoma school teacher who had her own aspirations of going into space. Gan Matthews is in our newsroom now with her story. Gan?
Roger, Carolyn Snavely was disappointed she lost out in the teacher in space competition. Nevertheless, she and her sixth graders at the Santa Fe Elementary School in Moore were looking forward to watching today's launch. The class day started off happily enough, with Carolyn Snavely fielding questions from her students about the mission.
What's that teacher going to do with me?
She's going to take you on a field trip out of the space shuttle, show you what it looks like.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
Later, Snavely and her class watched the first television replay of the launch. They were excited. They hadn't heard about the explosion.
There is the explosion.
Oh,
no. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
I know that prayer's not allowed in schools, but could we just pray for just a minute for their faith? Oh, God, let them be all right.
But they were not all right. And a few minutes later, the school's principal and some students lowered the flags to half-staff.
Shame we had to do this, guys.
Word of the disaster spread through the school. Other teachers came to Snavely's room to learn what had happened. One of them sent Snavely a note.
Carol Schmidt from the 5th grade sent me the message that God was watching over me, and that's why I was in the classroom today.
Despite today's disaster, Carolyn Snavely says she would still go into space, but she allowed as how she would first want to step back and reevaluate a few things. Jennifer?
Thank you, Gad. And of course, that Teacher in Space program was very highly received, and it also prompted a program for a journalist in space, and I believe you applied for that.
I did. I went through the applications and the essays just a few weeks back, so I've been watching this more closely than I might normally have, and watching it is just more than normal. It's just a kick in the stomach to see that. I guess I have the feeling that more than most people, those are people inside that explosion, and they were. We'll continue our coverage of what is a true tragedy in a moment. Expressing his deep grief about today's shuttle tragedy, this morning the president was informed of what had happened and reportedly reacted in stunned silence. His annual State of the Union address, which had been scheduled for tonight, has now been postponed until next week. NASA, as we reported, is suspending shuttle program operations for at least the next few days and forming an investigation board to look at possible causes of today's accident. A top official told reporters the space agency won't speculate on the causes of the crash based on only pictures and videotapes. This mission had been delayed 3 days for bad weather and some minor technical problems, but Jess Moore says NASA was ready for a launch.
there was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning.
Moore went on to say that he made the decision to launch this morning after conferring with NASA experts who felt all systems were indeed go.
General Tom Stafford was one of our nation's first astronauts. He flew on 2 Gemini space flights, as well as the Apollo 10 flight in May of 1969. General Stafford is now joining us live via satellite from Washington. General, thank you very much for joining us. I know you continue to have close ties with some of the NASA astronauts and personnel. Have you been in contact with any of them today, and can you shed any more light on this, maybe what caused the problem?
Well, it was a great tragedy. In fact, Mr. Onizuka was a close friend of mine, and I was down at the Cape on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to see the launch, and it got delayed, and I had to come back here to Washington. But it's what you might experience if you have a long program where you have risk involved, even though the risk is certainly minimal compared to what we had in the old days. It's just hard to talk about losing a couple of close friends. Dick Scobie also worked for me as a test pilot when I was commanding General Edwards. It's sure going to set the program back, but the program will survive.
And General, you have been involved with that for at least 2 decades, I believe. What impact do you think today's tragedy is going to have on the entire space program?
Well, it certainly is. Jennifer's going to set it back, and I could say it may set us back from a few months to a year, and the space station that we're going to have in the future is based on the space shuttle, and this is somewhat reminiscent of the tragic accident we had on the fire in about 1967. In fact, yesterday was the anniversary of it, and that set the Apollo program back about 18 months. But we'll recover, and it's just a sad day for the country.
Indeed it is, and thank you, General Stafford, for joining us live via satellite from Washington. I also talked with another man today who knows firsthand about the dangers of space travel. Charlie Dry was a test subject, a guinea pig of sorts for the Apollo space mission. His job was to design and wear the spacesuits the astronauts would later use up in space. He was also part of an investigating team into finding the cause of the Apollo 1 disaster. The 3 astronauts died there during a launch simulation 18 years ago. Dry says based on his knowledge, no one could have survived the explosion aboard the space shuttle this morning.
No, not at that position and time into the flight. Prior to that, had the main booster dropped off, we could have brought the spacecraft back and we could have landed it again. It possibly could have happened had there not been that type of an explosion. But that type of an explosion was total. There's nothing there.
Dry says NASA will immediately assign an investigation team and they will look at the film of the launch, and he says frame by frame trying to find out just what went wrong.
We'll be back in a moment. Stay.
Right, and let's take a quick look at the current conditions here in Oklahoma City. Right now we have a temperature reading of 66, the relative humidity 20%, barometric pressure 29.71, and falling winds south at about 10 miles per hour. Tonight, the weather just be very, very nice. Fair skies, light winds, and we'll call them cool temperatures. Now, tomorrow, some colder air will move in, and the wind will come up out of the north and northeast about 10 to 20, so it'll feel a little cold tomorrow, but Thursday will be right back up there. This morning, we had a low of 30. This afternoon, believe it or not, 69. Normals, so you can see we are above normal. Normal low 26, normal high about 48. And around the state now, all the temperatures didn't come in this hour, but we have enough of them to show you that it is quite pleasant. In the 60s, I think the 64 is a cool spot.
Those years of training are far behind Shannon now, replaced by the months of actual mission training with her fellow crew members. And then there's been the waiting. First, a launch postponement in March, and then others just this past month. But the waiting is over now. And at the final news conference in Houston just weeks ago, Shannon described what her part will be in deploying the Spartan astronomy package.
I'm going to deploy it, so I'll fly the arm and go over and grapple the Spartan and then position it out in a proper attitude. J.O. will be the pilot of the shuttle during this time, and he'll put the orbiter in the proper position. And then when everything is in the proper position at the right time, we will turn the Spartan on. It has cold gas thrusters, so that these thrusters will be able to cause the Spartan to maintain its attitude while it's released.
That will happen on the 4th day in space, but on day 1, when the shuttle roars into the sky, some mighty proud people will be watching from the ground in Florida. Shannon's husband and 3 children, of course, and her mom and dad.
She believed this is what the Lord wanted her to do, and so she's done it, and if she's happy about it, well, that's it.
I'm just really, really proud of her, and glad she can do what she really wants to do.
And Mrs. Moon will be there, too, sharing the feelings of all Shannon's fellow Oklahomans.
I'm going to be saying my prayers that she makes it back safely.
I've been in touch with Mrs. Wells, Shannon's mother, today, and with Mrs. Moon, Shannon's former teacher. Mrs. Wells was really unable to put her feelings into words because she's overcome by the tragedy of it all. Mrs. Moon, who feels...
Space Shuttle Challenger, liftoff from a freezing cold Florida to the cheers of the young students of the first ever U.S. teacher astronaut. Moments later, full throttle and point of highest stress. A massive explosion. The cheering stops. The horror sinks in. 7 Americans with the highest hopes, $1 billion worth of the highest technology, gone in seconds. The worst disaster in the U.S. space program ever. Good evening, this is the CBS Evening News, Dan Rather reporting. Never before in 25 years of Americans in space, never in 25 launches of the space shuttle had a life been lost. Today, that record went down in flames. Tonight, the search for survivors turned up none. The search for answers is just starting. Bruce Hall begins our coverage of a spaceship that became a fireball and a national tragedy. The deaths in service of their country of hero astronauts and hero teacher.
It was a very happy and confident crew that departed for the shuttle this morning. Future astronaut Krista McAuliffe said they had gotten over the frustration of the earlier delays. And technicians had an apple for her moments before she actually entered the shuttle. But the crew had to sit on the pad for an extra hour, while NASA took a close look at the ice that formed during the night in the freezing temperatures. There was concern that some of that ice could strike the shuttle during liftoff. Finally, after a detailed ice inspection, the word was given, go for launch.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
It was the first launch from the newly refurbished pad 39B in more than 10 years. NASA officials say they saw no indications of any trouble or difficulty prior to the horrifying explosion.
Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Oh my God.
The explosion appeared to destroy Challenger. The solid rocket boosters emerged from the fireball, continuing to fly uncontrollably for several seconds before plunging into the Atlantic Ocean, leaving a trail of smoke. Coast Guard Lieutenant Dave Baird watched the explosion from aboard a commercial jet.
Basically, it looked like it just tore itself to shreds and was on fire. And it looked like a kid's airplane being hit by the wind, and it didn't appear that anything could have survived from our vantage point.
The Coast Guard immediately launched an emergency rescue effort, but all that was found were small pieces of debris scattered over a wide area. NASA officials put together an investigation team this afternoon, but gave no indication of the cause of the explosion.
It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
NASA sources say the immediate attention is being focused on what appeared to be fuel or vapors that appeared around the solid rocket boosters and the main fuel tank a second or two before the explosion. NASA bristles at suggestions that they launched the shuttle under pressure today.
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority.
NASA officials announced this afternoon they are suspending all shuttle operations until there is some indication of the cause of the explosion. Bruce Hall, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
There was so much happiness this morning, so much excitement.
The only tears were tears of joy, the parents of schoolteacher Krista McCullough standing proud as their daughter and the others lifted off. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower. But in just 1 minute and 12 seconds, all the joy and all the excitement was dead, extinguished in a flash.
Apparently exploded. Impact in the water at a point approximately 28.64 degrees north.
Maximum heartbreak, torn up inside. This is the emotional part. And immediately the reporter begins to ask, what the hell went wrong?
And in the small towns that surround the Space Center, America's tragedy was their personal tragedy.
Saw it, I watched it, I cried. I couldn't believe it.
I came outside and I said, there it goes. And I watched it go up, and then suddenly, boom.
It's a great loss. The life, the knowledge, surely.
There were 7 victims who died today, and millions of others who still live.
I'm sad. I've cried, and I will cry again. I really will. I'm sorry.
Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Cocoa Beach, Florida.
Now, using our scale model of the Shuttle Challenger and slow-motion stop-action videotape of the accident in space, let's try to go over once again just what happened. First to the model. You can see that the Challenger on either side has the solid rocket boosters, the tanks that hold the rubber-like solid fuel. The large orange tank is the main liquid fuel tank. Now we'll rotate the model just a bit to roughly the position the Challenger was in just before the explosion. What we're seeing now is stop-action footage of the mission, just about 1 minute and 11 seconds in. We see the shuttle and one of the solid rocket boosters. At this point, a small flame leak is already visible in between. As we roll this ahead in slow motion, another flame leak appears above about 1 second later. Then, scant tenths of a second later, a large clear flame, and then the last massive explosion. The Challenger enveloped in a terrible fireball over the next 3 seconds. Finally, just past 1 minute and 14 seconds, you can see one of the solid rocket boosters blown aside in the top right-hand corner of the screen, the booster shooting off away from the fireball. The 7 crew members aboard Space Shuttle Challenger today were Spacecraft Commander Francis R. Dick Scobie.
Taking off airplane flights, and eventually an airplane is going to crash. He said someday that's going to happen to the space shuttle. And he said, I certainly hope that when that does happen, it doesn't bring the shuttle program to an end.
Well, what about that? Do you think that the shuttle program obviously now has been frozen in place for a time? Do you think that we'll have to re-examine the whole concept of the shuttle?
Well, certainly they're going to have to find out what happened, and until they can allow another shuttle flight to go up, and that is going to bring the entire shuttle program to a halt until they do. Right now they're beginning a process called failure analysis, where they will try in detail, looking at those pictures we've just seen, looking at other pictures, looking at all the data that came from the spacecraft, to try to learn what went wrong, to try, if possible, in some laboratory to recreate the accident. One of the hypotheses, and it's just a hypothesis we've learned, is that a piece of fan in the main engine came apart, a piece of metal, and that flew into the main fuel tank. That's one of the very strong possibilities right now, but as I said, it's only a hypothesis, and it'll take a lot of analysis to find out exactly what the problem was.
Okay, Bob, and that main fuel tank, of course, contains 500,000 gallons of highly volatile liquid oxygen and hydrogen, and so it is an explosive bomb, in effect, that is propelling the shuttle into space. Our coverage of this space shuttle disaster will continue with reports on the men and women who lost their lives today, the reaction of President Reagan, and the school children that Krista McCullough left behind.
Men and women, war veterans and first-time astronauts, parents, and even a classical pianist. Their commander was Francis Scobie, age 46, from Washington State, an astronaut after 22 years in the Air Force. This was his second shuttle mission. Second in command, pilot Michael Smith, age 40, a decorated Navy pilot from North Carolina. Like Scobie, he'd seen combat in Vietnam and trained as a test pilot. And like the commander, he was a husband and father. This was Smith's first shuttle mission. Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka was the first Hawaiian astronaut who believed in the benefits of the space program.
There are a lot of outcomes from these projects which will affect both our society and the rest of the world.
Onizuka is survived by his wife and 2 daughters. 36-year-old mission specialist Judy Resnick was a shuttle veteran, her assignment to operate the shuttle's mechanical arm. She was on board the shuttle Discovery in 1984 when a launch was aborted after the engines had fired. Gregory Jarvis was on board to conduct tests on the effects of weightlessness on liquids carried in tanks. Born in Detroit, trained as an Air Force satellite engineer, Jarvis was on his first shuttle mission. Ronald McNair, age 36, from South Carolina, brought a background in physics and laser technology to the shuttle program. This was the second trip to space for a husband and father who saw space travel as a calling for mankind.
I see it as something that we must do, and I see it as something that's part of man's nature to explore.
These 6, along with Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, now a tragic page in NASA history. Stone Phillips, ABC News.
When we come back, we'll try to analyze what happened. Edithman, there was an incredible anxiety that many people in the nation seem to feel about getting an answer to what had really happened. Well, the real answer may be a very long time in coming, but ABC's Lynn Shure, who covers space for us on a regular basis and has for a long time, is with us tonight in our Los Angeles bureau. Lynn?
Well, Peter, all the NASA experts, those review boards, are certainly going to check all the data they can gather, and they are going to be looking at all the pictures they can see. And those are the exact same pictures that we have been looking at also, and we've been taking a closer look at those last tragic moments. Here you see what they call a nominal ascent. All those words, textbook, picture perfect, and then suddenly a tiny flame just where the fuel lines go from the big external tank into Challenger itself. On the left with the arrow, a plume where gases from the tank are forming, obviously feeding the fire. Now you will see the flame creeping up the external tank in between the tank and the shuttle itself. This is the beginning of the huge catastrophic explosion that absolutely engulfed the entire system. You will see a second explosion right at the top of that big external tank. This is obviously what put the entire thing into flames and probably what destroyed the shuttle almost instantly. Now for a moment the smoke clears and we see emerging apparently the top of Challenger. We think this is the last picture we have ever seen of Challenger before it fell to the sea with its precious cargo. And as the sequence is going to continue, you will see that mammoth, horrible explosion on the right. One of the solid rocket boosters split away now from the tank and the shuttle itself. These boosters cannot be controlled once they're lit, so it has obviously gone off on its own into the wrong place, but it does not appear, I repeat, appear from what we can see that it was the cause of the explosion or that anything happened to it. So that's the sequence. We can see that. We can try to understand it. What we don't know is why it happened, and that's what we now need to find out. Peter?
Lynn, thank you very much. Joining us tonight from Houston is the former astronaut Gene Cernan from the Apollo program, and he also has seen this same sequence repeated many times throughout the day. Gene, I know your reluctance to speculate and share it with you, but do you see anything in those pictures which give us a clue?
Well, I think the analysis Lynn presented, the only one we have to work with because you know, we don't have access to the data, and it would take even us, if we had the time, weeks and weeks to analyze it. But just simply from the pictures, it sounds to me like her analysis, as it was portrayed, has got some substance to it. We can't answer why. We don't know why. We don't know why it might have happened, but from those pictures we might very well be able to see what happened. Remember that tank that she referred to is carrying thousands and thousands of pounds of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. Hydrogen is a propellant. It burns, it explodes. Liquid oxygen is the oxidizer, like air, which supports a fire, which allows it to burn. And if you burn it as a controlled substance, if you meter it and you burn them together properly like you do in the engines, it's an ally. But when you allow them to join in an uncontrolled atmosphere, what can happen did happen.
Gene, very quickly, I'm afraid, but can you tell us why there was no escape mechanism on board today?
Well, the shuttle was designed early with ejection seats so that if something occurred, the crew on those first 3 or 4 flights could get out. It was a test program. The evolution of the shuttle in an operational vehicle took those seats out. The only escape mechanism as it was planned was that the shuttle itself, with an impending problem, one you could see coming, could get off those tanks, turn around and land back at Kennedy Space Center. Obviously, they did not have time for that because they didn't know the catastrophe was occurring.
Gene Cernan, thank you very much, from Houston, and Lynn Scher from Los Angeles. When we come back, we'll have the reaction from the President and from Congress.
We've gone for main engine start.
As NASA moved into the shuttle era, the agency argued the flights were becoming safe enough for civilians to go along. Today, former astronaut Frank Borman said that was wrong.
It's a little improper to believe that we can put congressmen and senators and school teachers up there without exposing them to dangers that before were simply accepted by test pilots.
There have been close calls all along. In 1970, an oxygen tank blew up on a spacecraft headed for the moon. The astronauts got home safely, but James Lovell, who was on board, said the danger of spaceflight can never be discounted.
We're going at high speeds, great pressures going through the atmosphere. So this business is not your regular 8 to 5 business.
As the astronauts switched from space capsules to the shuttle, there were frequent equipment problems. In 1983, for example, no one was hurt, but power units caught fire as one flight was returning to Earth.
If we haven't been pushing our luck, we really have been pushing the technology pretty hard.
And with the federal deficit making it harder to fund the space program, Evel questions whether too many flights have been scheduled in an effort to make them more cost-effective.
I think the pressures, yes, I think the pressures have been there to increase the tempo and to, just as an airline does, make it pay for itself.
Whatever the case, the feeling from Capitol Hill tonight is that funding will now be harder to come by. NASA had hoped that putting civilians like Christa McAuliffe on board would build more public support for the space program. But after today's tragedy, the result may be just the opposite. Dan?
Thank you, Bob. The Challenger was one of 4 shuttles, a kind of flying mule, a dependable mule that had flown successfully many times before. We're going to show you one of those flights from last October 30th, side by side with today's disastrous mission. Challenger's 3 main engines had just throttled up normally. Then the explosion. It happened about the time when wind and other atmospheric conditions would begin to place maximum pressure on the craft. Had the flight gone on as planned, the 2 solid rocket boosters would have flamed out and peeled away. That was scheduled to happen within a minute past where the blast happened today. We'll have brief words on today's other news and more of our coverage of today's space shuttle disaster when we...
She was to be America's first teacher in space. And the president, too, watched as the shuttle exploded into flames.
Tonight, newly refurbished Launch Pad 39B, Space Shuttle Challenger was the first to leave its embrace in more than a decade. It blasted off in a blaze of fire amid the ice on the pad. A scant minute later, gone in all a consuming ball of fire. All that was Challenger, all the technology and hopes, and 7 people riding on the top of 500,000 gallons of rocket kick. 6 astronauts and a teacher who was us all, gone forever in a matter of seconds. Hours later, national mourning and a national eulogy from the president.
For the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we...
Special report. Disaster in space. Reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
It was there for all to see. Open, above board, almost routine. Another space shuttle launch. So many saw it happen. So little is still known tonight about why it happened. Tonight, the search planes and desperate rescue helicopter crews that had looked for signs of survivors all day in vain, tonight they were recalled. They will start again at first light. Ships are still crisscrossing off the coast of Florida. All they have found in the cold Atlantic is small debris from the once mighty Challenger. The largest pieces of that debris, no bigger than 2 feet wide and under 10 feet long. That is all that remains tonight of 7 hero pioneers and tons of high tech. Some of America's best and brightest young people, some of the most complex machinery and electrical apparatus in the history of humankind. It happened at Challenger's moment of full thrust, point of highest stress, where metal meets air at 2,000 miles an hour. It happened in real time before noon, a slow-motion horror for all who watched.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff. And it has cleared the tower.
The president, like all Americans, watched this on television.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
Challenger, go and throttle up. Challenger, go and throttle up.
Obviously a major malfunction. We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
Joining us now in Los Angeles is Leo Krupp, a former shuttle test pilot for...
And apparently with no warning that they wouldn't have been able to use them. This kind of catastrophe is not what the seats are designed for. This is a catastrophe that just cannot be allowed to happen. In this case, of course, it did, and the engineers are going to have to go back and take a look because this there is no crew member recourse for this kind of failure.
Inside the cockpit of the space capsule, is there flame-resistant, flame-retardant material in there?
There is, but there's nothing that could absorb the energy that is in either the solid rocket boosters. It looks like neither of them came apart because we could see them after the explosion, but there's certainly nothing in there that could absorb the force of an explosion of the hydrogen and oxygen that's in the tank, nor, I might add, when this occurs, the shuttle would be put at a strange attitude relative to the air. It's going 2,000 miles an hour, as you pointed out, maximum airflow, maximum airspeed. The shuttle would come apart. It just can't be built for those kinds of forces. This kind of failure cannot be allowed to occur when you design a spaceship. It's that simple.
And there's every indication today that it exploded in that great fireball almost instantly. Alan Beam,
yes.
Thank you very much for being with us this evening. The 7-member crew of Space Shuttle Challenger was varied from different backgrounds with different training. But as Bruce Hall reports, what these heroes shared, Virgil, Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, they met death when fire swept their Apollo 1 command module during a ground test. In 1970, astronaut James Lovell floated in weightlessness, but then Apollo 13 exploded on the way to the moon.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. We've had a main B bus underboat.
We had a main B bus underboat. An oxygen tank had been mishandled during manufacturing. Apollo 13 finally returned safely to Earth. The dangers of space travel apply to all. The Soviet Union, the only other nation to send manned vehicles into space, has reported the deaths of at least 4 cosmonauts. On October 12, 1964, a Soviet cosmonaut completed a successful 24-hour space odyssey, but in 1967, he would become the first person to die during a space flight when his Soyuz 1 crashed after re-entry. With us tonight in Colorado Springs, Colorado, is an authority on the Soviet space program. He is Nicholas Johnson, advisory scientist for Teledyne Brown Engineering. Good evening, and thank you very much for being with us. The Soviet Union, at last report, had reported today's American space disaster in one line. Does this put them ahead? Can it put them ahead?
No, it doesn't put them ahead.
And how much do we know about the Soviet accidents over the years? Now, I mentioned that I know we're having some audio problems there, and we hope those get cleared up for you. That the Soviets have reported the deaths of 4 cosmonauts, but you and others have written that there's some reason to believe that they've had more accidents than they've been willing to make public.
Well, we only understand that they've had 4 actual fatalities on 2 different missions about 4 years apart, the first in '67 and the second in 1971. But at 4-year intervals, there have been 3 other near-fatal accidents, the last occurring in September 1983, when 2 cosmonauts almost suffered an identical fate to what happened today.
The Soviets have favored unmanned space exploration, have they not? Well, they've accomplished many things with manned space flight, to make no mistake about it, but they've favored unmanned exploration.
Well, if you look at the ledger, then certainly they have launched more unmanned spacecraft than we have. But they've also launched more manned spacecraft, so percentage-wise, it's pretty much equal.
They don't use the same kind of propulsion system that we do for launch and getting into orbit, though.
No, they don't use the more exotic liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen. They simply use liquid oxygen and kerosene, which dates back to the V-2 rockets of World War II.
To have it clearly understood, the V-2 rockets used more solid rocket fuel.
No,
so go ahead.
No, they were liquid fuels, but they were simply kerosene and oxygen and not liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen.
And the technique, the knowledge of how to use liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen as we do in getting our space shuttles into orbit, the Soviets have that technology and know-how, or they don't, or we don't know.
They have never demonstrated it, but we believe they're working on 3 new vehicles, one very similar to the space shuttle, which will use exactly the same technique.
Mr. Johnson, when I asked you the question at the beginning where you had some trouble hearing whether this could put the Soviets ahead, you study the Soviet space program very closely, and you have for a long time. It's always hard to make a comparison, but obviously, clearly, this is going to set back the U.S. space program. And what advantage will that be to the Soviets? Are they in a position to take special advantage of that?
I don't think it will give them advantages because we're not traveling the same path in space right now. They are concentrating on manned occupation of low-altitude satellites. For the last 6 years, they've occupied that station for about half of each year. What we have been doing recently is simply deploying satellites and gaining new experience, which we lost in the late 70s. I don't think that this actually gives the Soviets an advantage. They're simply applying their techniques in a different manner.
Mr. Johnson, we want to move on to other coverage, but why have the Soviets never put a man on the moon? They tried for a long while.
Well, I think what happened, they were running very close behind us in 1968. And when we were successful with Apollo 8 around the moon in December of that year, then their program, which was a little bit farther behind, simply got canceled because they could not catch up quickly enough.
Thank you very much, Nicholas Johnson, Advisory Scientist for Teledyne Brown Engineering. The Space Shuttle, a truck, a kind of flying workhorse, reusable and lately used for the first few times as part of the U.S. military space program. This brought something brand new to the whole Space Shuttle program, secrecy and news blackouts about U.S. military payloads. CBS News Defense Department correspondent David Martin reports it's no secret the Pentagon is no fan of the shuttle, now more than ever.
Later this year, the Space Shuttle Challenger was to have carried a top-secret military payload into space, one of 5 military missions scheduled for the Space Shuttle this year. Now the Challenger is no more, now that all shuttle flights are grounded indefinitely, Pentagon officials are scrambling to determine just what effect today's tragedy will have on the military's race into space. The Pentagon is counting on the shuttle to carry vital communications and intelligence satellites, as well as Star Wars experiments, into space. By the 1990s, officials foresee a need for 24 military space launches a year, more if a Star Wars defense against Soviet missiles is actually deployed. With that kind of schedule, the Air Force already has warned that if one of the shuttles were to be lost, quote, we could never catch up.
We have main engine start. We have a cutoff.
Even before today's catastrophe, there were increasing doubts about NASA's ability to meet the Pentagon's space needs. So the Air Force is hedging its bets by building new rockets to back up the shuttle. The first of the new rockets will not be ready until 1988. By then, the Air Force will have run out of these older Titan rockets, which it currently uses. Now it appears the Air Force will run out much sooner, as the rockets are used to fill the void left by the loss of Challenger. Officials say some of the damage to the military space program can be limited by the fact that the Pentagon has the power to bump scientific and commercial payloads from the shuttle.
One way or another, Pentagon officials say they will figure a way to get all their satellites and experiments into space. But today's disaster will almost certainly add billions to the cost. This is David Martin at the Pentagon.
This is the 25th year of manned space exploration, just 25 years. A mere speck of time, really. And we've gone from brief space flights to short turnaround space shuttles. We launch satellites and walk in space so routinely. But are we pushing the limit? Should we slow down? Joining us again from the Johnson Space Center near Houston is former astronaut Alan Bean. Also in our Washington CBS News studio, Congressman Mervyn Dimely, head of the Congressional Space and Technology Caucus, and here in New York, Myron Mauchline, a former director of the Space Shuttle program. Gentlemen, what about it? Are we pushing the limit, and should we slow down? First, former astronaut Alan Bean.
Dan, I don't think so. I think one of the things that I've noticed in NASA all the time I was there, some 18 years, was that they never compromised safety. They never pushed too hard because of cost. They never compromised safety because of any political pressure or anything. So I feel that whatever went wrong was a mistake and will be rectified. But I don't believe it was because NASA was pushing too hard. I feel they never go beyond